Góðan daginn og velkomin öll á þennan seinni hluta ráðstefnu CERT-IS Netöryggi. Á fyrri hlutanum á mánudaginn þá fjölluðum við störf netöryggisveita og hlutverk þeirra og bæði frá sjónarhorni okkar hér á Íslandi og síðan vorum við með góða fyrirlesara frá Noregi og Danmörku. En í þessum seinni hluta þá beinum við sjónum meira að tæki og tólum og þjónustu fyrir netöryggi og þar erum við með 4 góða fyrirlesara sem ætla að fræða okkur í dag. Nú áður en ég kynni þann fyrsta til sögunar þá ætla ég að biðja ykkur að muna að við erum með spurningar að nota Q&A hluta á tólinu sem við erum að nota. Endilega nýti það sem best, þannig að við náum eins góðum upplýsingum og þið komið ykkar spurningum á framfæri við viðkomandi. Og ég ætla þá að skipta yfir í ensku þar sem að fyrirlesarar dagsins skilja ekki okkar ástkæra ylýramál. Good afternoon. Fredrik, our first speaker of the day is Fredrik Söderblom. He's a CEO and founder of StoredSafe, and he's going to give us some insights into StoredSafe and 17 years of IT audits in the US and the difference between the EU and US. Fredrik, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So, yeah, hi and welcome, and thank you for having me here presenting for you. So let's see if the technology is with me these days and see if I can get my presentation started. Let's see. Okay. Slide. Let's start here, I guess. Yeah. Okay. So my name is Fredrik Söderblom. I will put you shortly through some pain by doing some the ever so present small commercial about my company. I founded XPD in 2002 after almost 10 years of working at Hewlett-Packard as both a support engineer and then as system engineer as well. So back in those days, we were working a lot with IT security. I was part of founding the IT security team of HP Sweden. And in 2002, I eventually started my own company, XPD, which is we're 6 people today, and having on technical parameter security, and main customer area is the bank, financial industry, government, and military. Since 2003 and forward, we've been working together with an American company called Emineregroup and doing audits, mainly in the US, but also different areas of Europe. So all of these audits basically led to me co-founding a company called StoredSafe in 2011. This came as a solution to a very common problem, something that we saw at all audits, we still see at all audits, and that's the lack of a secure enterprise password management tool. This is very true for Europe, but it's very, very common in the US too. And yeah, the very, very short version of this presentation, I usually say is just 2 minutes, and we'll basically get you the gist of the actual presentation. And that's this, 5 to 10 years. Okay, so what does he mean with 5 to 10 years? Well, I can say after doing all these audits over since almost 17 years, the main thing we have observed is that the US is behind Europe in terms of technical security for, I'd say, 5 to 10 years, which is quite an amazing figure for most people. At least I thought US would be way ahead of Europe when we came there and started doing audits in 2002. But they're not, so they lack a lot on technical security. So if you want to work with technical security, US is the place to go. On the bright side and to the defense, they are basically 5 to 10 years ahead of Europe when it comes to IT governance, which is something we lack a lot over here, especially in the Nordic region at least. So that was the very short version of the presentation. I'll toss in a few of these just to make sure that you stay awake during the presentation, due to talking about audits could perhaps be perceived as boring. So I'll toss in some of the highlights we found during our audits. And this is actually for an audit in at the hospital. We had just started the audit. We had actually finished. Oh, yeah, we had finished an audit at a bank, and we were doing this one, and now we're doing the pre-assessment, looking through the configuration we have received from the hospital. And sitting in the apartment, I was basically reading through the firewall rule base for one of their main firewalls and skimming through around line 250 or something. I basically found a hole wide as this in their firewall that basically permitted any traffic in to the hospital from the outside. So what we do then is we basically pull what we call a showstopper meeting, because the customer is at high risk. Eventually, this turned out to be that they had actually lived with this problem for more than 1.5 years. And the way it initially got there was basically they had a firewall engineer working for them. He did a very good job, and he was so good, so he was offered another job at another company. So he left the hospital. And there was some type of connection that didn't work at the hospital. So someone actually added a line in the middle of the rule base that said, permit anything from the outside to the inside. And basically, I guess you can figure how the talk was going. It was, oh, is it working now? Yeah, it's working now. Okay, we're happy. Let's go. So that was a quite astonishing find. So what's actually the fun part of doing audits? I'm from a technical background, so basically I think the tech stuff is fun. And basically what we did up until starting to work together with Emineregroup, we were doing technical audits. The boring stuff, or actually, which I will hopefully get you to understand and see, is the IT governance part, which is basically what you realize after a while, that this is actually a very, very important part of your IT security. It's the typical standard, the policy, the standards, the guidelines, and the procedures. We'll get in even further about talking about the IT governance and the importance of it for good IT security a bit later. When we're doing, we basically developed a method where we're doing audits in the US together with the US company, Emineregroup. And so the mix we did was taking their competence about IT governance. So when we're doing an audit today, we're doing a governance audit. We're also doing the technical part, and we're doing it part of the same audit. This is typically delivered by 2 different companies at different times, but we do it together, which is, I think, of great value to the customer. So on the technical side, we look at the architecture and the design of the technical parts of the customer's environment. And we see how well it plays into the governance part. And we obviously also look at the technical implementation, which is basically how well was the architecture and design implemented in the real world, and how well does it play with the IT governance part. So if you have in the IT governance part, in your policies, you say that you need to have a 12-character long password. The technical design says the same, but the implementation, there's actually just 4-character long passwords here. We have discrepancies, which will be of interest for the customer to know. So what is an audit? Well, I guess some of you might have suffered doing an audit some way or another, but basically it's verified that the function is working according to design. What we're doing through an audit is basically gather information, we analyze it, and we verify it. And then we write a report and present a report. And who wants an audit? This is quite common in the US. It's somewhat common in Europe, in EC as well. Some of them typically stems from different parts of compliance. So like SOX compliance, HIPAA compliance, meaningful use, PCI DSS, or obviously GDPR. Advantages with an audit is that you get an external view to the problem. There is no political considerations when my team and I come to a customer. We're actually not part of the internal politics of the company or the organization. You will get the customer will get a completely external view of their problem, so to say, more not biased. And we try to actually talk to our customers and convince them that we are your friends. It's better that we find the problems than some evil guy on the outside finds the problems. There's no personal gain for us to push or deny different solutions, which is typically part of the political climate and debate within an organization. And what we produce is basically what you will get after the audit is the customer will have an action plan to mitigate observations. And the customer have their responsibility is basically to take the action plan and say, okay, we're going to implement 50 of these 70 recommendations. The rest 20 we will do risk acceptance. So yeah, here's another nice one. There's actually another hospital. My colleague, we're doing an audit. I'm out actually doing a physical examination of one of their suppliers. It turns out that my colleague Peter, he finds that he can log on to the intranet with a generic username and password, which is kind of bad because it means that we can now basically log on to the right visitors badges for ourselves. Because a lot of the US hospitals, basically what you're met at the entrance is not a nurse, but it's an armed guard with a gun that says, what are you doing here? So armed with these visitor badges, we can basically pass that guy. So that's kind of not so good, and we can do it externally. But to make things worse, we actually turned out that Peter also tried to log on to their employee VPN using the same credentials. And it actually worked there as well. So we could also access the internal medical system, X-ray, PACS, etc. So the lessons learned there was basically we're relying too heavily on AD authentication and not really having fine-grained controls of that part. So who typically orders an audit? Well, it's either internal audit department, board of directors, or the CIO. And who performs an audit? Preferably, either, obviously, you can have an internal audit department that actually will take care of this for you. But where we're coming from, our point of view is we're like an independent third party. And we're doing the governance part. This is typically a classical accountant role, and then the technical part. And the technical part where we came in initially was if you're a good engineer and you can build networks and construct them and design them and do architectural design, it's like a good carpenter. It's really not hard for a good carpenter can enter your house and say, "Oh, that part is really bad. You need to redo it." And it's roughly the same for the technical parts. So if you can build, you can rip it apart. I usually say it's the easiest job on earth, basically walking around and say, "Oh, well, that's not good enough. You need to redo that." So what do we do then? How do we perform an audit? Basically, we need to define scope. The scope will define the cost for the audit. We can look at everything, but that tend to be a bit expensive. So we tend to, together with the customer, decide for scope. We're looking at these services, machines, and scope it down. And then if they want a white or black audit, black audit is basically we don't know anything about the environment. We do this very seldom because it's not very cost effective. And a white audit, we basically we say, okay, we want the network topology maps, and we want the configuration for these routers and that firewall. And typical for at least US customers is that they either want an internal or external audit or both. So they want to know their external security posture or the internal security posture. They could also be that they order a compliance audit, like the meaningful use stuff or HIPAA or PCI DSS. Yeah, Hospital C. This is also a nice story. Doing an audit for another hospital, mid-US. One big thing for HIPAA compliance for hospitals is that it's a big no-no to leak what's called PHI, protected health information. And at this hospital, we found that they were using Star Trek look-alike devices for communication between nurses and doctors. They were actually modeled after the Star Trek communicator, which was kind of cool. But the thing was that we found out that it was actually using a very old Wi-Fi technology called the WEP. So basically, we could listen in and record all the traffic between the nurses and doctors, and that everyone else in close proximity of the hospital could do that as well. And that's a very bad violation of the HIPAA compliance. Sometimes we do some extra stuff. We do testing the staff. We typically do this either by social engineering attacks. Those are really fun. We try to buy people's passwords for a chocolate bar or for a $1 bill or $10 bill, or try to exchange them, give them USB sticks and etc. So just to see how well we can, or if we can enter the building just using like a postman clothes or something. Other parts we do on request is, and kind of popular these days, is doing phishing campaigns, where we using open source tools like Goldfish to do a phishing campaign at the organization, and with different setups to see how is the awareness, and these type of things basically measure awareness and how much time you have spent on awareness training for your staff, or how much time you should spend. So what do we actually do? Well, we start up a couple of weeks ahead of audit, and we send out request lists. We request a lot of information from the customer. Obviously, policies, network diagrams, configuration files. We have a lot of questionnaires we send out to the customers regarding a lot of the technical details. Typically, it's kind of, well, it's fine. Most customer comes back, especially in Europe, and say, we don't have any policies. And we said, okay, yeah, that's fine. It will be an observation that you need to spend some time maturing your IT governance. We're trying to get this ahead so we can read up on the customer before going there. And in the best of world, that would happen, but it seldom does. We typically might get some of these information ahead. Typically, we get it when we get on site at the customer. So first thing we do is basically having a startup meeting just to make sure that we got it right. Make sure that the scope is defined. Okay, we're going to look at the AD environment and your DMZ and your external firewalls. Then what we do as well when we're agreeing on the scope, we make sure that we have a test plan, we define it, and we get a sign off on the test plan. And this is especially important for US customers. The test plan basically says for the technical test, what are we going to test, when are we going to do it, from where are we going to test it, and how are we going to test it. And the customer then gets a chance to say, okay, you can't scan that subnet, you can't touch that system, and you need to do this during weekend, and you can do this during daytime. So we get the test plan and make sure that we have a sign off on it. Typically also, I'd say in 80% of the cases, we have the test plan, we got a sign off, and the customer also almost always have this opportunity to not inform his staff. And by doing this, he gets a measure on how alert they are in the form of log management. So typically, and sadly enough, when we're doing external scans, it's actually never happened that they discovered us, which is kind of bad, I'd say. Yeah, Hospital D, another nice example, also a typical cardinal error that my friend Peter discovered while we were doing an audit, and this is a classical one. Let me see, yeah. The guest Wi-Fi was basically set up in a way, and this is a very common error that we find, was set up to allow, well, it's guests that should be allowed to go anywhere. So the firewall rule basically said, okay, if they're coming from the guest network, they can go anywhere because anywhere is the internet. Yeah. The problem is with different types of firewall, anything can also mean the inside. And when it does that, basically you have opened the entire location organization for internal access from the guest network. And in this case, we were able to get on the inside. We could talk to the SCADA systems in the house. We could get to MQ. So this was a very large show. We could actually be sitting at the parking lot outside the hospital and going to internal system without any authentication, because just using the guest network. And yeah, it was protected with some stupid pre-share key that was never changed. It was on a plate somewhere in the reception area. So cardinal error when doing firewall rules, just make sure any isn't a good choice. Sometimes you need to negate your internal network instead as a destination. This was a nice, fun customer as well. It was a bank. We were doing, when we came to them, before we actually got a set of fantastic policies. It was amazing, and we were blown away. It's like this customer really, they had it, they nailed it. So the fun thing was when we started our interviews, which I will talk a little bit later about the methods we're doing. Well, while interviewing one people after another, it turns out that no one of the firewall guys, the database guys, the Windows guys, no one of them had heard about the policy and even less read it. And it actually turned out that they just bought the policies and just a week ahead before us coming there. So there was actually no work done. They just bought a set of pre-made policies. So that's not really the way to do it. The other thing we found out, where they had their mainframe, which was based on an IBM machine. We actually found that and that's the reason for the picture. When looking through it, we found that out of 694 accounts on the machine, a whopping 582 accounts had no password whatsoever. It was blank. You could just log in by using the username and press enter for password. So how do we do? How to perform an audit? Well, basically, as I said, there's a lot of interviews with key personnel. For most, we're doing a lot of IT governance interviews. We're talking technical stuff with the network guys, database, Windows, Unix, Linux guys, and backup people. And all the information we get, both from interviews, documentation, and configurations, and governance, we analyze them, we gather them together, we sit down and look through them. And what we do in the third step is basically we test our theories and measures and evaluate. Okay, so I saw this in the documentation, I saw this in the configuration, which means if I do this with Netcat from the outside, I should get this, which could elevate privileges on the inside. So that's part of the test plan, basically. And what we do basically is we look through all these theories and all measures and evaluate externally and internally, and we do it to make sure that we eliminate all false positives. Because false positives, according to us, is the mother of all evil. You don't want false positives in an audit report because that will hurt the customer in the long run. So typically we use a laptops with some Linux distro. We're using hard disks that can be destroyed. So we leave them, we bring a fresh hard disk to the customer, and then we leave the hard disk to the customer when we leave the assignment. Using virtual servers for some of the external testing. You have like a different set of toolbox. We can talk about them later. There's some really good tools, free open source there that you can use on your own. So I think this is kind of a picture of the NSA triage, and it's kind of nice, and this is how we work. We're doing the network scans, we're doing the interviews, and we examine the configuration and documentation. And basically all this is information that goes into evaluation and testing the theories, getting our preliminary findings, and then we basically evaluate them and make sure that we eliminate false positives. Then we write the report. So that's the process. Another example. This was a court. Turns out that through a configuration mistake, it was actually possible. It was possible for us from the outside. An application published in DMZ was actually meant to be able to view some type of documents from the court on the outside, but due to a mistake in the setup of the replication, we could actually reach from the external Oracle database and grab information from the internal Oracle database. And we can actually pull out juvenile records. And this was also not very good. What happened to Bank B? I say Bank B to the last because it's one of my favorites. This is Bank C. Arriving one morning at the customer site, I find a lunchbox like this. It wasn't even in steel, it was actually in plastic. It was standing outside the door. this customer was located in Florida, so kind of hot outside. So I went inside, and IT was on the side of the bank. And so we park the car and we ring the doorbell, and we stand there looking at this box, and eventually someone will open after 10 to 15 minutes. And so I asked the IT CIO, and what's that box doing out there? And then it turns out that the box contains the weekly backups. And the backups are supposed to be picked up by a guy from Iron Mountain, which is a backup storage provider in the US. And the thing is, due to them not having a receptionist at the IT department, which was a separate building, this guy from Iron Mountain, he was and it's Florida, so it's hot. So he was really bummed of standing at the door for 10 to 15 minutes, sweating like a pig and waiting for the backup tapes. They made an agreement that on Wednesday morning, they put out the backup tapes outside the door and he can just pick it up. Sounds great, doesn't it? Well, the problem with this was that basically on these tapes, they had everything on the bank, all the accounts, everything was there, encryption keys, everything. So we asked them, okay, so what happens? So obviously the backups are encrypted. And the customer looked back at me and said, what? Encrypt? No, they're not encrypted. So basically you could sidestep their enormous firewall implementation by just going on a Wednesday and pick up the lunchbox outside the door, and no one would notice, and you would have access to the entire backup of all vital systems at the back. That was a nice one. The final report, well, it takes a lot of time to write it. So if we typically spend a week on site, we spend 4 to 5 days writing the report and testing theories and stuff and checking back and forth with the customer. Usually it ends up with 100 or 150 observations and recommendations. We tie them together, and we have like an observation, what's the risk for the observation, and then a fairly detailed recommendation on how to fix it. It's actually 2 parts of the report. There's one main part with an executive summary and root causes, which I'd say is basically the best part of the report. The root causes is we identify what's the main problem, why are they in this situation? And that's typically 3 to 4 different things. It could be weak IT governance processes or a lack of resources. It's never a technical root cause. It's always an IT governance root cause. So, and a summary of key areas of improvements. This is typical a table of content from a report. And so we have one part with detailed information, which I've spoken about, the risk and likelihood. Risk is something that's, if something happens, what is it, low, medium, high, or critical? And then likelihood, how possible is it that it would happen? So when we're talking about mitigation, and when we're talking governance, you can lower the likelihood, but you almost never can lower the risk. And we do a summary of risk and estimate the cost, and also suggest a prioritization for the customer. So this is how typically a detailed technical recommendation could look like. So you have an observation. Observation 1 is all outbound traffic is unrestricted. All the risk with it is here, and the recommendation is here. Then you have observation 2, risk 2, and recommendation 2. And then we'll leave a little area here down for the management of the customer, where they basically comment on our report, and this is what we use when you, after a year or 2, do a follow-up audit. So the format makes it kind of convenient for the customer to address the problem as well. This is like a summary that they get as well. So on the networks, there could be like 10 or 15 different problems and the aggregate risk level on all of these. responsibility? Is it the CIO or is it the board of directors? How much of an investment is it to address and fix it? And what's our recommended priority? So this is more of a boilerplate for something to the customer to work with, and they can decide, and they have to decide on. But at least they get some input from us, what we think that they should focus on initially. This is something I talked about earlier. This is what we call, this is actually a net risk map. The risk map is basically, we gather out the different observation. If it's a critical risk with a high likelihood, it ends up here. And what you see as the red line here is basically every customer has their own risk appetite that basically the management has to decide on. How much risk are we willing to take? And then basically when you got that and you can map it in, what you need to do then is that you need to lower the likelihood of the identified risk. It's not harder than that. So basically all the mitigation makes that the likelihood goes down. So if you have something with a low impact but a high likelihood, it falls below the risk appetite, and that's something that easily you could just decide not to on a management level, not to address, because it's basically below your level of risk appetite. Yeah, this a water treatment plan. This was kind of fun. We found other drawing is not from the customer. This is just something I found on Wiki or something. Yeah. Oh yes, this was actually a county, and on the county they were responsible for the water treatment, and so driving out there and looking at the equipment, we saw, okay, we have the county's routers and switches and everything, and according to them, what they told us before in the interviews and in policies, the water treatment plant was a completely isolated system, obviously because you couldn't control the water treatment process from within that system. But when we arrived at the place, one funny thing was that there was like a gate, so you couldn't get in at the front gate. But if you drew in on the area next to the water plant, it was actually an opening, so you could drive in, so you could just pass the gate. While in there and then looking at the equipment, okay, so this is the router and switches from the county, and over there is the router and switches for the water treatment plant. But what's this cable? It's actually connected in between these two Cisco 6500s. And then facepalm, and turns out, yeah, okay, yeah, they're connected. It's a bummer to have to go out here and control it. So we basically wire them together to be able to do management sitting in the city instead of having to drive out to the water treatment plant. And on the county's network, they have like a college and sheriff office and a lot of public people. So that was not such a good idea. The final meeting with the customer is typically gathers clients and technicians. We present the top 10 findings. We present an action plan, a draft report, and we ask for feedback. So typically these meetings were done on a Friday if we're doing a week-long assessment. And so the report is not really done. We present the top 10 findings, and then we go back home and rewrite the report, and we will present the report, send it over to the customer as a draft report, and tell them that, okay, you have 2 to 3 weeks to send us feedback on this, because we want to eliminate the mother of all evil, which is false positives or errors in the report. And since 25 to 50% of our data is based on interviews, we might have misunderstood someone or something, or we might have gotten an old conflict file or something. So these 2 to 3 weeks are very, very important for us to get feedback from the customer on the draft report. When we have the feedback and we're done, we basically publish a version 1, and then the report is ready and released, so to say. Yep, that's basically the board basically, what happens then is that the board or management needs to decide from the report what to remediate, either accept the risk or prioritize the different action and what part of the recommendation should they follow. And typically you do a re-audit after major changes or after 1 or 2 years. So a question where we get a lot of time is, can you fix it? And this is stopped by ethics. Well, basically, the IT auditor ethics is if we do audit at the customer, we never do consultation there. And if we do consultation, contracting work for the customer, we never do an audit. There's a solution that you could discuss that's called micro audits, and I won't go into details now. We can discuss later if someone is interested, which basically where we stay behind, and instead of fixing problems, we do a knowledge transfer to their staff, and we help them fix every recommendation that the board decides to fix, and we walk it through with their staff, but they are behind the keyboard and doing the fixes and reasoning with us. And then we can control it and say, okay, yeah, A14 is fixed now, and I can report it directly to the CIO. So policies, boring. Yes, they are. At least I thought they were extremely boring when they hit me first, when I was working as a programmer, and that was even before I started working for HP. The thing is, in a couple of years, you find out it's a must, and actually it makes life easier. And the thing is, if you look at a customer with good governance, we typically if we come back after a year or two, it typically looks much better. A customer without governance, they will basically, okay, they fix everything and then it will deteriorate slowly over time. So the governance part, by writing standard guidelines and processes, will make sure that you can keep your IT security at an acceptable level. So you understand the power of it, basically. And these parts are part of what the US is so good at, is basically having business controlling IT instead of IT controlling the business, which is at least the way it's working in a lot of Nordic countries. So for the US people, it's very natural that, okay, so in hospital, it's basically the board of directors says, okay, what do we need to do to be able to make patients more happy and treat more patients? Oh, we need this. And then it zips down to the technical department, okay, and gets translated, okay, you need to set up an e-service for patients. And then a requirement for firewall comes up. In Sweden or other Nordic countries, it's typically the IT people say, oh, I want a new firewall. The old one is too old and can't cope with the traffic. So different ways of doing it, and I think I like the US way a lot better. And top-down approach and policies, you need to make sure that the policies comes from the board, and the staff needs to understand and be part, not like the bank I talked about where we just bought the policies. Here's some common frameworks. We'll work a lot with COBIT, which is a complete, very nice framework. It's free of charge. And then you obviously have the ISO 27000 framework as well. I actually saved the best part, the best example for last. This is my favorite one. It's regarding a bank. This is actually how ATM machines looks in the US, and I'm sure several of you are familiar with it. You can actually move them around. This is kind of fun. We had completed an audit at one customer site, and we went to this site, and we started looking at their network topology, and it looked good. Turns out that they had like a mainframe. They had some segmentation in place. Sadly enough, they had segmentation, but no filtering. So they had different zones, but all traffic was allowed to flow between the different zones. So we found, okay, what's this VLAN? It's called ATM. Oh, that's for all the ATMs. Okay, so that's kind of cool. And what's that? That's the mainframe. Yeah, but it's on a different VLAN, so they can't touch each other. And on the side, the ATM machines everything is encrypted with triple S. From when you punch everything you enter at the ATM is encrypted all the way. And that's true. But what we did is we went out to McDonald's, where we know that this bank had one of their ATM boxes. So we ordered a Big Mac or something, and we went and sit in the restaurant. So we reached for this ATM and rolled it out slightly. At the back, you could actually see the network cable. So we just unplugged the network cable and plugged it into one of our machines. And voila, we were actually on the bank's network. And they never actually figured that someone would do this. So using the ATM's network cable, we could actually access the bank's mainframe because there was no filtering between the two. So that's also a fun one. So I'm getting close to my end of my time slot. So the top 10 challenges that we found over these years are: number 10, no separation of duties. This is, we can discuss this further, but yeah. No or bad change management. Basically, this affects a lot of things, and this is also part of good IT governance, that you need to make sure that you control your changes and that you have, that you can track and traceability on your changes. Logical errors in the firewall rules. I mentioned some of those. We find them every single time we do a review. It's almost like no one ever read through the complete firewall set, but we do it every time. It's cumbersome, but we find a lot of good things in there. Typically, what we recommend to this part is that you need to do peer reviews before you submit changes, and then you should do your own reviews on internal reviews, at least quarterly or every 6 months or something. No or bad patch management. We actually found customers when they had critical systems missing 10 years of critical Windows patches. This is not so good. So if something enters on the inside, like, oh, there's highway to eternal blue, we can open up every machine on the inside. Bad patch management or no patch management, also part of governance. This is also very, very common. There are some really good FOSS tools out there, and also not FOSS tools that can help you evaluate your AD or AD's configuration. And it's very common that we find a lot of errors in the AD configuration. And this is typically very, very serious because some of the examples I mentioned was actually based on AD authentication. There's some stupidity going on in terms of AD. You have Microsoft have stuff like normal AD user can add 10 machines to the domain by default if it's not turned off. You need to make sure the KRB TDT user that its password is changed every 40 days and stuff. There's a lot of things to check there. Very weak or no passwords. Typically what we found is, okay, so we have 300 switches, routers. Oh, yeah, it's really hard to remember different passwords. We just use one, and we never changed it. So, yeah, congratulations. Okay, yeah, we have 10 different passwords and for 10 different environments. And we share them here on a network share. Oh yeah, okay. Now you just made it worse. Okay, so it's private privilege management account. Privilege account management is a top issue, and it's a serious problem because if this hits you, you're into a lot of other troubles as well. Having no SOC or CERT or NOC or whatever, and no CM or no log management is also very, very common. Basically makes you completely blind if someone is attacking you. This is also very common. It's getting better. No internal segmentation and no filtering, so you don't have any defense in depth. The whole purpose of this is basically giving you more time. More alerts should be tripped by an intruder so you can actually find them. Do not ever run a flat internal network. It's not good for your health. This is extremely common in the US. They have no filtering at all for outbound traffic, which makes it extremely easy for any malware to reach its command and control center on the outside. And number one, weak policies. And if you would say for Nordic areas, it says no policies at all. But yeah, weaknesses in policies is really the top issue we find. 5 to 10 years behind Europe in terms of technology, but 5 to 10 years ahead of Europe in terms of IT governance when comparing US to Europe. So, but really, in first place, we have Dave. This is my favorite cartoon. I use it all the time when I do presentations for a report. So on the left side, we have data security. We have a lot of firewalls and stuff and the antivirus software. And the other corner, we have Dave, the human error. And he always wins. So, questions?
For a very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
There is, well, I have at least one question here.
Okay, shoot.
Goes like this. How well do your customers typically implement your recommendations? And have you come across companies that are in the same steps or worse off in the following audit? And if so, why do you think that is?
Oh, do you think you could say again?
Yeah. How well do your customers typically implement your recommendations? And have you come across companies that are in the same steps or worse off in the following audit? And if so, why do you think that is?
Okay, yeah. So the question is basically how often do they follow our recommendation? And if I've seen customers that basically look worse the second time we're coming to them, yeah. I'd say in terms of, I'd say like 20% is really bad on implementing our recommendations. 80% are really good at following them, but obviously it's our recommendations, and the 80-20 rule is there as well. So I'd say even a good customer says, okay, we have all these recommendations from XPD, we will implement 80% of them, and 20% we will do risk accept on. We have some customers that really have been basically fantastic coming back to and see that they actually implemented everything and really in good shape, and doing the re-audit takes no time at all, basically. It looks fantastic. And the second question was if it's looking worse, it's typically that they still they haven't addressed the root causes that we identified in the audit, and the root causes is 100% always points at IT governance. So typically, if you have bad IT governance, it will actually lead to really poor IT security in the long run. Was that an answer or clear enough?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
There's another question on the same note. Do you ever come to the same client again later, and they now detect your scans, which they didn't before?
I think it happened. It has happened once or twice, but organizations tend to have a hard time analyzing a lot of log data from the external firewall. And especially if you don't have any log management or any tools that doing automatic alerting, you will most certainly miss it. It's kind of worrying, and it gives a heads up for the customer, because when we were doing a scan of like a subnet /24 subnet, it should basically generate like 17 million log lines or something during a couple of hours, and that should really stand out like a Christmas tree.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any other questions, so I'd like to thank you again for an excellent presentation, very interesting. See you later, I'm sure, Fredrik.
Yes, thank you. And if you have any questions or any in the audience have any questions, just feel free to drop me an email or call me.
Thank you. We will.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
So our next speaker is James Tarala. James is a principal consultant with Enclave Security based out of Venice, Florida, and a SANS senior instructor. In his presentation, attendees will learn practical steps to creating meaningful key performance indicators that can be communicated to leadership to facilitate helping the organization to meet their goals. Right, James?
Absolutely.
Very welcome. The screen is yours.
Well, thank you. I'm just going to share here, so apologize here, 1 second, while it seems to be taking a second here. Okay, I may have to leave and rejoin the meeting. It looks like my permissions reset on me, so I apologize. Let me leave the event and I'll come right back in and hopefully it will allow me to go ahead and share my screen, okay?
Okay. Einhver smá tæknileg vandamál hjá James, en við skulum gefa honum smá tíma til að koma inn aftur. Og á meðan við bíðum eftir James, þá rétt að upplýsingum við það að í tengslum við þetta erindi hans, þá býður SANS ykkur sem þáttakendum upp á 10% afslátt af námskeiðum hjá þeim. Ef það tengt við sem sagt vottun frá þeim og ef það keypt fyrir 31. desember 2020. Þið getið nálgast þessar nánar upplýsingar þetta hjá okkur eftir ráðstefnuna.
All right. Well, I apologize for the brief delay there. Looks like we have everything working like it should, hopefully. So
you're on, and your presentation is on as well. So
excellent.
Again.
All right. Well, thank you. And just to make sure, and you're able to see my slide deck, okay? That seems to be okay.
Yeah, we can see it.
Excellent. Great. Well, thank you again for having me. Again, my name is James Tarala. I'm a principal with a group called Enclave Security, and I've worked with a number of different organizations over the past 20 years in the space of cybersecurity. Most notably, in the last few years, the last 20 years or so, I've been a senior faculty member for the SANS Institute, working in the space of audit and assessment and cyber defense in general. And I've also been a volunteer over at the Center for Internet Security and the Institute of Applied Network Security, where I spent most of my time over the past 10 years or so. So today what we're going to be talking about is we're going to spend some time talking about developing key performance indicators, or KPIs, for the purpose of cybersecurity. And for the sake of the presentation, what I found is, for bandwidth purposes and such, is I'm going to introduce and leave the webcam on and sort of introduce the topic that we're going to talk about today. And then I'm going to go ahead and turn the webcam off to focus on some bandwidth to make sure that the presentation goes smoothly for the rest of the time. So the principle that I want to talk about today is the idea of really integrating cybersecurity into business management. It's a topic that's been brought up a number of times over the last 20, 30 years. And it's something that there's still, even in 2020, it feels to me a disconnect between business leadership, business stakeholders, and what's going on at a technical cybersecurity level. And business leadership, like any other area of a business, is really looking to turn cybersecurity into a managed space. The trouble has been, for many years, in cybersecurity, we've relied on hiring wizards. And what that means is that we've looked to try to find very smart, very technical, very engineering-centric individuals that we can hire into our organizations who have the answers. And for many organizations, frankly, the approach to cybersecurity management has been, how do we get the most or the best wizards to work for our organization that have that secret magic, that secret understanding or knowledge to defeat the hackers, to defeat the people that are trying to break into our organizations? And how do we find those people, those wizards, to effectively give us the ability to achieve what our business's goals are? And the problem is that there are only so many wizards in the world, and it's not a sustainable model. And frankly, we're to the point in our industry in cybersecurity where we need to be able to look past that. And rightfully so, businesses are asking, how do we measure what we're doing in cybersecurity? Now, we can talk about the effectiveness of return on investment. Is that a conversation we should be having? Should we be looking at financial measures? I mean, we can have those kinds of conversations. But what I want to talk about over the next hour is understand, where are we today? How do we develop performance indicators? How do we communicate this information to leadership and to stakeholders in a way that resonates with them? So that's where we're going to go ahead and get started here this morning. Now, for the sake of bandwidth, like I said, I'm going to go ahead and make a couple changes here as far as the video, just to go ahead and make this a little bit easier for us. Hopefully we'll save a little bit of bandwidth there in the process. So what I'd like to do then is really focus on going through and looking at the performance indicators for security itself, and start by laying a bit of a foundation in this space. And what you'll see is, for us to go ahead and lay a foundation for metrics and lay a foundation for key performance indicators, we have to define what our goals are. We have to know, what is it that we're trying to achieve? And my fear is that a vast majority of organizations don't really have an understanding, or haven't really taken the time to define what are their intentions as it relates to cybersecurity. There's lots of conversations around don't get breached. There's lots of conversations around don't end up on the news, don't end up on the newspaper, don't end up on a blog site somewhere where people are losing reputational value. So that metric by itself, though, doesn't seem to be sufficient, because there's such a wide variety of techniques, a wide variety of things that we can do to try to avoid that scenario. We need something better. We need something more detailed that we can measure. And the best equivalency that I have here, or the best example or analogy that I can give when it comes to this don't get breached concept, is more and more, I think people are looking at cybersecurity in terms of health, in terms of hygiene, and trying to think of this in terms of what can I do to be healthy? And we can wake up in the morning and we can say to ourselves, well, we're going to do things today so we don't get breached. Just like we can wake up in the morning and say, well, I'm going to wake up today and be healthy. And you can do that, and you can make that sort of assertion. But the problem is it's not meaningful. It's not specific. It doesn't give clear goals. And what we need to be able to do is understand specifically what are the things that we need to do. And so before we can define metrics, before we can define, what are these key performance indicators that we're talking about, we need to make sure that we lay a foundation and understand some concepts first. And this is going to go along nicely with the previous speaker and some of the things that we're just talking there on the policy side regarding some of those other controls we were just discussing. And so going back to some of those governance principles, I'm just going to echo some of the things that were just talked about in the previous conversation. If we're going to set and make a decision to measure ourselves, Douglas Hubbard, who's written a number of books on measurements and metrics, and many of you are probably familiar with some of his writing, he has a quote that I've really enjoyed, and I find myself using quite a bit as we talk to organizations. And the quote is that we measure things to make better decisions. And the idea of this is that we use key performance indicators, we use metrics, we measure things because we're trying to make better decisions as an organization so that we can, again, have a manageable set of goals, hopefully, that we can achieve. So to do this, I think one of the very first things that we need to do, and I'll go through this quickly, again, sort of repeating some of what the last speaker was speaking about as well, is we do need to define what are the goals for our security program that we're trying to achieve. And part of this is the idea that we need to make sure that we have a charter for the program itself. Now, whether we formalize this or not, I mean, that's something we can debate, but cybersecurity is a program, like any other program that you would institute inside of an organization. And what that means is programs have goals. Programs have responsible parties. They have leadership structures. They have stakeholders. If you go to places like the Project Management Institute, you can learn all sorts of things about what it takes to manage a program in general. So to start most programs, we need to document a security program charter and say to ourselves, what are our goals? Who's responsible for those goals? Who are we empowering to achieve those goals? And then empower the stakeholders that we define in that charter to govern the program itself. And the hope is that as we define stakeholders and people who are going to take those leadership responsibilities, ideally a steering committee, ideally people in the organization who are going to have that responsibility at an executive level, maybe sort of a broad group of the organization to make decisions, then they can clearly document what their intentions are. And that goes back to the previous speaker here in the conversation on policies. We set an overall goal, and we say these are the overarching goals of the program itself. And although it may sound simplistic, lots of us still talk in terms of confidentiality and integrity and availability of data. And it may be just that high level. And maybe we go a little deeper, but something at that level, at the charter level. But then we have to define how are we going to achieve those goals that we've set for ourselves. And that's where policies and governance really come into play. That also is important for us to be able to decide then where our priorities for defense are. As much as we'd love to follow the principle of uniform protection and always do the right thing in every circumstance, the problem is we have limited resources. We all do. Every organization we work with has limited resources in what they're doing. So we have to be able to prioritize and say, what are the things that we're going to focus on first? And it's not a situation of what's good and what's not good, or what's effective and what's not effective, but it's what's the most effective? What are the things that matter the most to us, and establish those priorities? From there, hopefully we can create a plan for quality measurement and management. We'll talk about that here in more detail in just a few minutes. And specifically look at defining specific measures or metrics for success. As we gather those metrics, as we have that information gathered, then hopefully we can report that information to stakeholders and let leadership make those good decisions, like Hubbard mentions. So the warning here, though, of course, is there are no shortcuts. And that's the thing I'm always afraid when I give these presentations. Whenever I give a talk with something like key performance indicator in the title, or give a presentation on metrics or something along these lines, I always have this fear that what everyone's really looking for is for me to frankly send them a Excel spreadsheet, or to maybe point them to a website where they can download a list and say, okay, what list of metrics do you think we should use? And what everyone ends up doing is, maybe you download a list from me and a list from someone else and maybe a few others, and you copy and paste from all the lists, and then we have a list of metrics, and that becomes sort of the master list. But my fear is, though, is that shortchanges the process. We measure things because we're trying to make better decisions. And in terms of cybersecurity, we're trying to make sure that the things that we're doing help us ultimately to achieve the goals that we've established for ourselves. And so you can't make a decision on what to measure until you've made a decision what your priorities are. You can't make a decision on your priorities until you've decided what are the good things that you believe you should do. And all of these things end up working together. And so one of my favorite quotes is from Mark Twain, the author. He's got a number of good quotes that I really like. But one of them you can see on the screen here is the idea that if you eat a live frog first thing in the morning, nothing worse will happen to you the rest of the day. And that's the thing that I like to sort of start this conversation with, is because when we talk about metrics, when we talk about key performance indicators, we have to start by making sure that we understand what are the goals we're trying to achieve, how are we going to achieve those goals, and then from there, then we can try to understand what those KPIs might be that we want to start to measure. And if we skip these steps in the process, honestly, we're bound for frustration, confusion, program failure. People are going to have different ideas, and we need to have agreement. We need to come together as an organization to decide what are those things that we need to be pursuing. And frankly, I really do believe that it's time for our industry in cybersecurity to grow up and do hard things. And that's where we want to talk about what are those things that we can do to achieve the goals that we're describing here today. Now, there's lots of different places where we can find these controls. If you're looking for example, security defenses, there's lots of places where potentially, we can find ways to define appropriate controls. And one of those things is, we can find them from regulatory requirements. Many of us are going to be regulated in one way or another. There are going to be standard setting bodies that are going to say, these are the things that you must do to be in business or to participate in this government entity, or to be a part of an organization, sort of a wider industry body that we may be a part of. So regulatory requirements or industry standards are going to be ones that we're going to have to make sure that we're aware of. The other one that you're going to find generally influences this process when we're defining controls, of course, is contractual obligations. There's going to be some situations where we find that contractually we agree to do something. For example, we mentioned PCI as an example that many of us are familiar with. If we look at the Payment Card International Data Security Standard, or look at PCI DSS, we don't have to follow that as organizations. But contractually, we've made an agreement with the payment processors to say, we agree in order to do business with you that we'll do these good things. Contractually, we agree to that. Or many of you may find yourself in situations where your business partners will ask you, if there's a breach, they'll say they want to be notified if you have a breach. Again, it's not something you're going to find in an industry standard, but one of your partners has asked you to do something, and if it's in your contract and you've agreed to it, then it seems like it's something that you should do. So these are places where a lot of times we end up starting. We start with regulatory requirements, industry standards, contractual obligations, and a lot of times we'll add on top of this things that we just believe are right to do. But I know many organizations are simply working so hard just to get through these first three that doing those best practices oftentimes are the ones that struggle, that take us the longest to actually get to. But these are places where we can get started. So if we're looking through those and you kind of look at just some of the groups that are out there, I mean, you can see some of those different organizations and some of the different groups that have these sort of standards in place. And as we've looked at this space and done some research here, what we're finding is, honestly, is that there are literally dozens of organizations now that are coming up with these security control standards and documents that are out there. And it's getting confusing. And one of the things that we've seen organizations struggle with a lot, in fact, to the point where almost on a weekly basis now, I'm taking questions from organizations on how do I go about meeting all of the different standards and requirements that are being asked of me and still be able to do the things that are right, the things that I know that I should do in order to best defend myself. And many of you may know, and I've gotten a couple chats already, just people have mentioned that with the SANS Institute, many of you know that I've had an opportunity of working not just with the SANS Institute, but with the Center for Internet Security and helping define some of these standards. Specifically, I've been a participant in working as one of the authors on the Center for Internet Security's critical security controls for about 12 years now, where I spend a lot of my time researching. And
James,
yes, sir.
Sorry for interrupting. Can you press the full screen button so we can see it in a bigger view?
Sure. Let's see. Does that help a little better there for everyone?
Excellent, thank you.
No problem. So I'll show this slide for a second. I'm going to leave this slide for just a second and show you another resource that we've been doing here as well. And one of the things, the questions, like I said, that have come up has been, when we look at these standards, there appears to be lots of competing standards. And one of the gentlemen I work with is a gentleman from the U.S. National Security Agency who's left now and works in the private sector, named Tony Sager. And Tony makes a comment in many situations where he says that most cybersecurity standards are simply copied and pasted from other existing cybersecurity standards. And it's honestly becoming very, very popular these days to create new cybersecurity standards. It's just simply one of those things we're seeing with regulators, we're seeing with government agencies and others as well. And in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing this screen for just a second. Hopefully I'll be able to bring up another screen here that you can see. I'm going to share an Excel sheet here, so hopefully everyone can see this. All right, are you able to see that screen okay then too, I hope? Or maybe someone can tell me if they're not able to see that.
Yeah, we can see it, but again, if you put it in full screen. Yeah.
There we go. All right, and so I'll make each of these just a little bit different. So one of the research projects that we worked on, and we've been calling this actually our COVID project, where other people have been learning to bake bread, or other people have been, maybe educating their kids at home. One of the things that we've been doing is doing analysis of cybersecurity standards. And so what we did was we went through and actually looked at many of these standards that are out there. And as you can see here, I know it's going to be very small to see on my screen. I don't expect everyone to be able to read this. I'll try to make it a little bigger so you can read it. But what we did was we went through a number of different cybersecurity standards, including the Center for Internet Security Controls, NIST guidance, PCI information, ISO standards, and others. And what we did was we created, as you can see here, a spreadsheet going through each of the control requirements in some of these standards. And you can see here again the CIS controls, or if I scroll down a little here, you'll see we have things like the NIST Cybersecurity Framework or ISO 27002 or others. And what we've done then is we took those controls, and the first thing that we did was we tagged each of these responsibilities, each of these controls, to the system over here you'll see in this column that basically says these are the good things, or this is the system that the good thing we would need to put into place in order to achieve the goal of the controls that we've defined here in the center. And then from there, we took each of these control systems and we categorized those into a small number of topics. And from there, what we were able to do is we were able to come up with a coverage map to basically say, when we mentioned that there's overlap between some of these control libraries, this is what we actually meant. And so what we did was we looked at each of these different statements, like the CIS controls, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, ISO 27002, or other documents that are out there. And what we did was we started to build a common control library that actually would go through and share some of these frameworks and the controls that are in place. So rather than having competing standards, we would be able to go through and actually say, can we show where there's overlap between those? And so what we did was we went through each of these control statements and said, can we boil it down to a small number of controls? So rather than dealing with thousands of controls, which is, I think we've gone through about 2,000 or 3,000 controls so far, we've been able to boil those down to about 300 statements that are commonly made by each of those different standards that are there. And as you can see on the right, we've basically mapped a series of common statements, like you'll see here in the center, to each of the individual statements over here of where exactly each of those controls are said or asked to have been done. And from there, then we were able to say, all right, if we look at statements, for example, let's say we look at something like patch management, which is always the one that sort of caught my attention. And we said, okay, even the last presenter had mentioned that patch management is something that clearly most of us would agree that we should be doing. But when we start to look at some of these cybersecurity standards, we start to ask ourselves, okay, well, which standards are actually specifically asking you to do patch management? And as you look through these, what you'll see is you'll see a few statements in the CIS controls, a few statements in the Australian Top 35 or their Essential 8 document many of you may have seen. PCI makes a statement about it. But if you'll see others that are there, you'll see other areas, for example, COBIT or CMMC or NIST 800-171 or even ISO don't specifically come back and say you should do patch management, which would seem like a fairly common thing that most of us would want to do. And so we were able to do some analysis here to try to understand better what sort of controls are in place and then summarize that with a heat map a bit here to be able to better understand that if we boil security down to a small number of domains, and that's where we basically see here on the left, we've basically gone through and come up with 11 total domains here, that you can see under a common library the number of statements that would need to be made versus how many are actually made by each of these individual standards and such that are in place. So as you can see, again, we'll come back over to our slide deck here for just a minute. Again, there's a lot of these competing standards that are out there. And frankly, not all of them are created equal. So the point is to get started is someone has to make a decision in your organization to be able to say, what are those things that we believe are right, that we believe we should be doing in order to defend ourselves? If you're looking for a place to start today, one of those places I know many people have gone has been the Center for Internet Security. Obviously, this is a project that's near and dear to my heart, one that I've been working on for about 12 years now. And the idea at the Center for Internet Security is we've tried to take a lot of these different resources, and tried to better understand these control libraries that are out there, these standards and such, and be able to say, what are the good things that we can do to defend ourselves that actually will make a difference in stopping some of these attacks, some of these threats that a lot of us have realized. So we do utilize a volunteer army. We've been very thankful to a number of participants in the Nordic countries, and I've had the opportunity to visit on a number of occasions in the last couple of years to present on the controls and talk about some of the things that our project has been doing here. And as you can see, we've basically come up with a list of roughly 20 families or 171 individual subcontrol statements saying these are the things that we believe organizations can do to defend themselves. Now, there are areas along within this list that we have that definitely we've seen fluctuate and change over the last 12 years. But what we're finding is if you look on the left-hand side, is that more and more we're starting to see agreement on what we believe to be what we're calling cyber hygiene defenses. In other words, what are those basic, most simplistic, most common things that organizations can do to effectively defend themselves? And there's been minor changes to these things over the last few years, but there's been a lot of agreement from literally thousands of organizations around the world that these are the things that we should be focused on. We had the privilege, one of our, at CIS, our CEO for a number of years was a lady by the name of Jane Liu. Jane used to be our Army Signals Intelligence in the US, and later became Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security in the US for a number of years. Her husband was actually the US Ambassador to NATO under the Obama administration. Well, Jane became our CEO for a number of years, and one of the things that she would always tell us is that she would say, I understand technology, I understand engineering. She said, cybersecurity sometimes baffles me. But she would say, I understand the concept of hygiene. And she says, if I go to my dentist and I ask my dentist, listen, I don't want to lose my teeth. I don't want my teeth to fall out. What do I do to make sure my teeth don't fall out? She said, my dentist will tell me, brush your teeth every day. The dentist will tell you to floss on a regular basis and have regular dental checkups. And as an engineer, she said she'd always question her dentist and say, is there something more I should be doing? Should I be taking vitamins? Should I have a certain diet? What are the other things I should be doing? And at the end of the day, her dentist would always tell her, listen, there's always more things that you can do. But if you really want to make sure that your teeth don't fall out, focus on these things. Brush your teeth, floss on a regular basis, and have regular dental checkups. That's what hygiene looks like. And we've applied those same principles over to cybersecurity. And we're to the point, I think, in the industry now where we know we have a good, strong understanding of what the good things are that we need to do to be able to defend ourselves. And if you see those basic controls on the left, those are the things that we've said as an industry that we believe are some of the most important things that we can do to defend ourselves. I bring this up in the context of KPIs because many organizations that I talk to don't have a clear understanding of where they believe their control library should start. And with all these competing standards, with all these different ideas that are out there, how do we figure out, without a wizard, what it is that we should be focused on? And I think there's enough good industry guidance out there that we can use that hopefully you're no longer having to rely on some of those. And if you are looking for a place to get started and you're looking for a document to maybe seed this effort, this would be one that we would have you consider. And again, to show you some of those hygiene principles that we've been referring to. Now, in the latest version of this document, there's a couple of things that we've done. We've tried to improve the consistency and wording of our subcontrols. And one of the big things we did is we tried to implement a policy of one ask per subcontrol. And the reason for that was we wanted to be able to eventually map each of those subcontrols to measures. And I'll show you that here in just a minute. We also wanted to bring more focus on multi-factor authentication and application whitelisting or application control software. That's something that we've been focused on quite a bit over the years, but we wanted to emphasize those as effective controls because we're seeing those more and more help organizations in their efforts to stop some of the most common attacks. One of the project goals that we have at Center for Internet Security or with the CIS controls is we want to make sure that we always have this principle that says the offense must guide the defense. And what we mean by that is we want to understand what are the techniques, what are the tools that our attackers are using today. And as we understand better what those techniques are that are being used today, then we want to make sure that we have a plan in place to make sure that we can stop those most commonly used attacks. And multi-factor authentication, application control, these are two tools that we're seeing repeatedly are effective in stopping some of these cyber attacks that we're seeing. So we wanted to make sure those were more heavily emphasized. We wanted to account for improvements in technology. We wanted to make sure that we had better alignment in these most recent versions and support development of related products like measurement guides and metric guides and things that I'll show you here in a second. One of the things that we developed then in this most recent version is a model of looking at how controls then can lead to measurements and help organizations track maturity from an overall cybersecurity program. And so what we did was we put together the idea, the concept that you'll see on the screen here. The idea being is, in order for us to clearly communicate to business stakeholders what it is that we believe we should be doing or where we are, or you always hear people asking about things like benchmarking or where we stand on things like comparison to our peers and those sorts of things. Well, to get that sort of information, you have to go through a common process like we indicated earlier. And so the first step of the process, like we said, was to identify what are the good things we should be doing in order to defend ourselves. Do we have agreement on the controls that we believe we should be putting into place? So as an organization, the very first thing I would ask is, have you made a decision to say, these are the good things we believe we should be doing in order to defend ourselves? Now, ideally, like the previous speaker said, this is something that we should put into policy. We should document, we should be in agreement on and clear to everyone, this is what we should be doing. Now, once we've defined and said, this is what we believe is right, and we have agreement on that, and we're clear on that, then what we can do is we can measure ourselves and say, are we doing the things that we believe we should? And you'll see here that I have a difference between a measure and a metric. And one of the things that we did when we defined our terms is we made a distinction between those two words. And the idea is something like this. So if I were to stand up against a wall and someone were to bring a measuring tape next to me, you could measure about how tall I am. And you would see that I'm about 2 meters tall. And so you could put up a stick next to me or a tape next to me, and you could basically say, okay, James is about 2 meters tall. That's about how tall he is. Now, that's a measure. That's a quantification. That's saying that's James's height. Now, on the other hand, just because we have a number doesn't necessarily mean that we have any sort of judgment on that number. So the measure, what we're saying, is a quantification. And metrics, what we're saying, are then the judgment call on the quantification or the measurement that we take. So in other words, if I say, all right, James is 2 meters tall, all right, some of you may say, well, that's tall, or some people may say, well, that's short, or some people may say that's average. But that's a judgment that's placed on a measure that's been taken. In other words, you establish a threshold for what good looks like, or what a particular norm might be. And those are the metrics that we need to define. Now, as we're going through this then, as we're talking about measures and we're talking about measuring yourself and such, you can do this in different ways. So if you're trying to get a general sense of where your organization stands in light of a common library of security controls, one place is you can simply do attestations. In other words, I can simply ask you questions. I can interview you and I can say, all right, are you doing something good, yes or no? And when I do my audit practice, I know the tool that you see on the screen there, this is a free tool that we give away over at auditscripts.com. So if you want to download this, please feel free. It's one of the many tools there that we give away to people to be able to use. But the idea is that we believe there's no reason for a deep dive if people aren't doing the basics, or you're struggling to have control mechanisms in place to actually be able to gather intelligence that you can use. And so what we normally will start with when we're working through this process with an organization is we'll start the process by simply asking questions. So we'll say, for example, okay, do you have multi-factor authentication in place? To what degree? Do you have application control in place? To what degree? And if I go to an organization and ask, do you have application control in place? And the answer is no. Well, there's really no reason for me to dig deeper. There's no reason for me to try to do measures. There's no reason to say, well, let's go measure all of your machines and find out how many have it in place, because you've already told me you don't have it in place. And so the initial idea we have with this is let's start the process by simply asking questions. The quality of the audit maybe won't be as deep, but we can still make good decisions, hopefully, with the resulting information that we learn. So again, a simple attestation-based approach is generally where we have people start, but that's just a starting point. In version 7 of the CIS controls, we adopted Six Sigma as our quality management program that we wanted to be able to bring along with what we're doing. Originally, before version 7, we had established our own metrics and our own thresholds for what we thought good might be. So starting in version 7, we said, why are we doing this ourselves? Like, why are we trying to reinvent the wheel? Why not go back to the industry and find out what the industry says quality should be? And so we relied on Six Sigma. We looked at what Motorola had done and what General Electric had done and other similar organizations who really helped popularize and define Six Sigma. And the idea was to define thresholds for maturity for every defined measure that we had in place. We don't expect organizations to be perfect, but we want to be able to establish a standard for what quality looks like. And I think, as many of us know, the whole idea behind Six Sigma is not necessarily to achieve perfection and not to achieve Sigma level 6, but to say what level of quality is acceptable for us. We understand that there are going to be defects in the process. It's always going to happen. But what level of defect is acceptable? And so we wanted to bring that quality concept forward and talk about it in context of cybersecurity. So what we did was we said, so as an example here, in the CIS controls, one of the things we'll talk about is in our very first family of controls is the idea of asset inventory. And so one of the things that we ask organizations to do is maintain a detailed asset inventory of the systems that you've authorized to be in your organization. So we have this generic statement on the left that says we should maintain a detailed asset inventory. So one of the questions that we believe then we should probably ask is say, all right, what percent of our organization's hardware assets are not presently in the organization's asset inventory? Now, if you don't have an asset inventory, well then 100% of your assets aren't in the asset inventory, which means you can't quite achieve Sigma level 1. Right? You can see the percentages down there at the bottom. But let's say that you're a larger organization. Let's say that you have, well, let's just keep it simple. We'll use round numbers. Let's say you have 10,000 assets, physical assets in your organization that you're responsible for defending. So let's just say 10,000 is our number. And you go to your asset inventory and you look inside your asset inventory database and you see that you have 9,000 assets defined. So we'll keep it very simple. So we're going to say that there's 10%, let's say, of our assets are not in that inventory. Okay, so we're missing some. So clearly something's not quite right there. Okay, so if we know, okay, we ask the question then, what percent of our organization's hardware assets are not presently in the asset inventory? Well, we say the answer is then, in our case, 10%. All right, so if we ask the first question, Sigma level 1, are we at 69% or less? Well, we are at 10%, and 10% is less than 69%. Therefore, we have achieved Sigma level 1. Okay, now we know. All right, what about level 2? All right, well, level 2 is 31% or less. Again, we are at 10%. Sigma level 2 is 31%. All right, still, we've achieved level 2. All right, great. 10% is less than 31%. All right, what about level 3? Well, level 3 says 6.7%. And again, it turns out 10% is greater than 6.7%, so we don't achieve Sigma level 3. Okay, so we're back at Sigma level 2 for this particular control. And these percentages, it turns out, are something that Six Sigma defines for us. So we don't have to come back and figure this out on our own. This is something that Six Sigma has already done. So we're not making this up or having to talk in a language that leadership doesn't understand. Many leadership teams already know about these programs and understand what Six Sigma and quality is all about. So the idea then is we can go to an organization and say, when we get to the maturity of being able to measure these statements, we can start to actually say then, all right, our goal will be, let's say, Sigma level 3. And maybe you say, boy, that sounds scary though, that 6.7% of our population wouldn't be achieving our security goals. You know, doesn't that leave an opportunity for an attacker to break in finding one of those machines? Well, of course, absolutely. We would all love to be Sigma level 5 or Sigma level 6, but why not start with something that's realistic? Because you're going to find in many cases that 100% of your assets don't meet these requirements. And you're not even getting close to level 1, let alone level 3 or 4. So start with something achievable, work with leadership to understand where that quality level, maybe you say the first level we're going to achieve is Sigma level 3 consistently. And then once you've done that, then you're going to try to take the step to level 4 once you've gotten everyone up to that consistent level. So again, it's a way to make a methodical process for being able to decide where you are in relationship to some of these controls. And again, I know it's probably a little hard to read this on the screen. I know it's probably a little bit small, but you can actually download a guide over at the Center for Internet Security, or we have a copy of it over at Audit Scripts as well. When we created this. And the idea is all of those questions, we have basically 171 questions that tie to the 171 control statements that we have in the CIS controls. So the idea being is you say, here's the definition of all the good things we believe we should do. So you make a list of those things. Again, that's what policy is. And then from there, you say for each of those statements, how do I measure myself and say, I want to make sure I can find an effective, consistent measure for each of those control statements that I'm making. And so, for example, what we see here, this is control family 1. These are the statements that we have. You'll notice that we've got about 9 statements here. These are the statements all in that family 1 around asset inventory. And like I said, each of our families of controls have these measures defined for you. So again, we didn't want this to be something we just talked about theoretically. This is something that we've done. It's been online for a couple of years now, and something we want you to be able to use if you think it's useful for your organization. Along with that, then what we believe is that as we define measures and metrics, right, we define controls, controls lead to define measures and metrics. Our next step, we believe, is that leads to automation. And so the idea here is that these are the systems that we believe you need to have in place in order to achieve these metrics in order to gather that data. So if I'm doing an assessment of you or an audit of you, I would be looking for these individual systems. Now, specifically, as we're looking through these, what you may find is if I'm looking for, let's say, network level authentication here at the top, I know, for example, that most people will use Cisco ISE to do that. Maybe Aruba ClearPass, or maybe a similar tool. But I'm looking for something along those lines, right? So I'm looking for those kinds of products to be in place, because the idea is as I define these, I can start to automate collecting information or automating answering these questions that we have here, rather than doing this on a manual basis. Because the reality is we're just not going to do this consistently on a manual basis. We need to have automation in place to help facilitate collecting this information in order to show risk to stakeholders. And where this is leading to is now more and more, as we start to deal with our clients, what we're finding is customers that have been doing this with us for a number of years are starting to get to the point now where, instead of just using attestation-based approaches and starting with, let's say, an Excel spreadsheet to go ahead and manually answer questions that people may have, we're now able to move forward and actually use automated tools. And what you'll see here is a couple small screen captures from RSA's Archer and ServiceNow's GRC module. And the idea is that now more and more, as we deploy systems like we see here, we can take data points from these platforms that we've deployed and aggregate that into these governance risk compliance platforms, or GRC tools, and start to do data analytics. And so again, if we've agreed on what good looks like, and we have an agreement on what controls that we want to have in place, and we have agreement on what measures need to be in place in order to make sure that we're doing those good things, then we can start to look at tools that can help us aggregate and automate grabbing that information and pulling that into some of these data analytic tools, so that really cybersecurity is starting to become more and more of a analytics question, more about data science, and less about the wizardry we mentioned earlier on. And so the future, if I sort of pull out my crystal ball and sort of say, where do I see cybersecurity going, and where do I see us in the next 5 years? I think more and more organizations need to embrace the idea that we know what good looks like. Now let's figure out, how do we measure ourselves in light of those standards, and then be able to use this information to report to stakeholders, where are we? Where are the risks we're accepting, and what decisions now need to be made in light of the information that we've been gathering? So that's the hope, right? That if we have defined cybersecurity hygiene, okay, so if we start with that, right? If we say, all right, cyber hygiene's been defined, whether you agree with the Center for Internet Security or not is totally up to you. I certainly don't want to impose one standard on you versus another. But I do think you need to decide a standard for your organization. What are the good things you believe you should be doing? You can subscribe to one of these models that are out there, or you can make your own, right? It's totally up to you, but you do need to make that decision. But we do have, as an industry now, standards of care. More and more, we're seeing this codified in law and regulation. Especially in the US, for example, I know the CIS controls of the project we're discussing here, many state governments have actually taken those and actually said, we expect our constituents to follow these as part of state law now. And so more and more, as this becomes a standard of care, information security is becoming a business intelligence problem. And so the hope is these automated measures can show us the way then, as far as being able to understand then what are the good things that we can be doing, and better understand where gaps exist in that program. So like we said, the idea behind this being that we wanted to be able to understand key performance indicators. That was the whole reason we gave the presentation or got started here today. So we said we wanted to make sure that we start with a control platform and then use that to guide the way like we're describing. So every organization is at a different place in this journey. You're all going to find yourself at different places. Remember those basics that I brought up in the very beginning of the presentation. So again, if you don't have a program charter, start there. If you don't have a stakeholder committee, form one. If you don't have policies, document them, right? But start with the basics. And then from there, you can sort of grow and mature that program. And I always like to leave with very specific, very sort of actionable things for you to consider before we take questions here this morning. In the next week, if this is something that you think is useful, download some of these free resources that I've talked about over at the Center for Internet Security or over at auditscripts.com. I think you're going to find a lot of good free resources that you can use to help start with your moving your program forward. And from there, decide what standards are going to drive your security program. Start with that. Then in the first 3 months following the presentation, following what we're doing here today, then review your program charter. Or if you don't have a program charter, create a program charter and use that to make sure that your leadership team is on the same page as you. Define the committee, make sure that you have a clear group of stakeholders that are going to be engaged in your process, and make sure everyone agrees on the goals that you're trying to achieve, whether that's standards, whether that's regulations, the good things you believe you should do, and make sure those are reflected in your policy. And then within 6 months, maybe you don't do all 171 statements here, 171 measures like we have defined in these guides, but maybe choose 5 or 10 and report those to senior leadership and start to track those on a regular basis. And as you become more mature, add more measures and little by little add some of those KPIs into there, but start small. And it's the old joke that you always hear people say is, how do you eat an elephant? And you eat it one bite at a time. And that's all we're asking you to consider, but lay your foundation first. And then from there, go ahead and again, grow that program with KPIs and measures like we've described. Now, I know we'll have a couple minutes here to take some questions, but before we do too, just to leave you with my contact information. If you have any questions for follow-up, email is almost always the best way to reach me. Again, you can find resources over at auditscripts.com, Center for Internet Security I mentioned, and of course the SANS Institute as well. You'll also find we have some courseware there if you're going to learn a little bit more about some of the things we're describing here today. So we have a couple minutes left. Are there any questions that I might be able to answer in the time that we have remaining?
Thank you, James. I have a couple of questions here already for you. The first one is, well, I'll take both of them at the time if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
How does CIS work as an aid in implementing ISO 27001 is the first question. And the second is, do you consider CIS controls as a complementary tool for someone that is implementing ISO?
So good questions. So first of all, in fact, if I can, what I'll do is let me go ahead and bring up that Excel sheet that we had a little bit earlier. And what I'll do is I'll share my screen and I can show you very specifically how these two overlap. That may give you guys a very specific answer to the question. All right, let me go ahead and see if I can share this. So one of the things that you'll see here is if we put down these controls to a very specific a set of systems, and that's what we see over here in column A. So let's say here's a list of all of the things, the systems, the technologies that we would consider putting in place in order to do all of these different standards that we see across here. What you'll see is if you look at each of these statements, these little blocks that we have here, for example, if I look at patch management like I brought up earlier, the way that I found this was, you'll see at the top, I do a count if statement by counting how many times that's referenced by this particular standard. And so if I put ISO, and in fact, I'll just kind of hide this column so you can put ISO and the CIS controls side by side. So if we look at this column here, you'll see the CIS controls. And let me sort of go one at a time. This column would be a comprehensive list of every possible thing all the standards are asking you potentially to do. These are the things that the CIS controls are asking you to do. So you can see there are some gaps, right? There, it's not one for one. And then over here, you can see how many times ISO asks you to do sort of that common set of things that are in place. And again, you can see some gaps. But so what you'll find is that none of these standards are exact. And they're not going to be completely complementary. But you will find that there are definitely mappings between the CIS controls and ISO. So if you look at, for example, doing the majority of these, let's say that you did all of the things that were included in the CIS controls, what you would find is pretty much, if I'm summarizing here, that you would go ahead and implement pretty much all of the technical controls with a couple small exceptions. And you would find that really where you had to focus your efforts would be on the governance side. In fact, specifically, you'll notice things like physical security and incident management and personnel management is another one that's highly focused on inside of ISO that the CIS controls don't really talk about. In fact, what you'll find is we actually specifically have said with the CIS controls that we don't want to be a governance library. In fact, you'll see these areas here. We actually are debating taking these out of future versions of the controls to be simply a technical reference, focused on these controls here. So the big gap that you would identify between ISO and the CIS controls is mostly around those governance requirements. We've listed that out of scope. So we certainly could say this could be a roadmap to towards achieving the technical side of ISO, but you would still want to make sure that you consider those governance aspects as well if you're looking to achieve compliance with both.
All right, thank you. There is another question here, which is pretty long.
Okay.
But I'll see what I can do. This is from Svavar Ingi, one of our attendees. He says, I just had a discussion with Johan Lindros, responsible for IT governance audits. And the short answer to your questions is, in average, our customers spend less than the expected 7 to 10% on IT security. Now, I'm not sure if, well, let's see. However, it also depends on industry. For example, hospitals in the US spend way less on IT security than recommended. Smaller credit units are often below as well. Larger banks are more often close to 7 to 9%. I'm sorry, this is not a question for you. In fact, this is an answer from Fredrik Söderblom to our previous questions. I'm sorry about that.
But I would agree that there's definitely tiers of organizations that are doing investments, and I would agree with those numbers. I think hospitals, healthcare in the US is quite poor right now when it comes to a lot of that investment. I would definitely agree.
Okay, that's very good to hear that you agree on this. So I don't think we have any more questions for you at this time, James.
Well, very good.
So I'd like to thank you for your participation, your presentation, very interesting. And I hope we all have learned a lot from it, I'm sure.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm always glad to have the opportunity to speak with you all. And again, if you have any questions or follow-ups, again, hopefully you can use my email, and I'm happy to answer any other questions that may come up later.
I'm sure we can. Thank you again, James.
All right, thank you.
So to our next speaker today, who is Morten Wea. Morten is a member of the Mnemonic Threat Intelligence team. And then accompanying him is Robbie Peralta. As I said earlier, Morten is a member of the Mnemonic Threat Intelligence team and has extensive experience as an incident handler. Robbie Peralta has spent the past 5 years focusing on security monitoring technology and services, and has worked with companies across the Nordics to establish and improve their capabilities. He is also the host of the Mnemonic Security Podcast and is responsible for Mnemonic's operations in Iceland. Morten will share his personal experiences with incident responses and gives insight on how organizations can be prepared for security incidents. Morten, welcome, and the screen is yours now.
Morten Wea.
Hello.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Or
Thanks for having
the
me.
vlogcast, as it now is called. We are in Iceland right now.
Yes.
Say hi to everybody.
Hello,
Favorite
Iceland.
island. And we're actually in the future as well. It's the 21st of October right now.
Cool.
So this is a trippy interview we're going to do here.
I should check the lottery tickets.
Yes, maybe you should. But Morten,
Yeah.
who are you? What do you work with?
My name is Morten, and I work with threat intelligence in Mnemonic. I started some 8 years ago within the information security business, and I've been working the full cycle of incident response since then. I started my climb in the Security Operations Center, detecting and assessing incidents and alerts, where I worked for 1.5 years.
Good old SOC work.
Yes. Steady workhorse of every business,
Yes.
or should be. And I also came up with some recommendations for how to fix the problems. So that
Cool.
was how it all began, and then I moved on to governance, risk and compliance, which is a complete different end of the scale.
Out of the SOC into a suit.
Yeah, more or less. So after some years there, I ended up in threat intelligence, where it's
Awesome.
so I work on sharp incidents, but though I only work on the incidents that warranted a full-blown IRT, so not like the everyday operational incidents, but where the shit really has hit the fan, and we have to,
APTs.
yes, and we have to move out and fix the problems, yeah, like superheroes.
Sexy. Very sexy.
Indeed. So what I mainly do is incident management, making sure the real heroes, the analysts, get what they need when they need it. And I also work as a middleman between client management and technical expertise, making sure the technicians are shielded from the ties and translate the nerd speak to business speak and vice versa. This is, I kind of like doing this because I have a background both in management and a technical background with a master thesis or a master's degree in informatics, and also one in management.
Wow. So you like school.
I like
and
school. Yeah.
You really like school because now you're a PhD candidate.
Yes, I'm a PhD candidate, researching decision making in incident response, or more precisely, how to make sure decisions taken in incident response are the right ones in the right time. So basically, make sure that you do the right things as fast as possible.
Let me just stop you there. That's really important, because in a incident response situation, you know more than anybody else how decisions get made just very hastily, and it's very seldomly the right decision to make if you're doing it really quickly.
Well, if you're basing it on a gut feeling, it's a good chance it's the wrong decision you're taking. And I'm trying to prevent people
from trusting their gut.
Yeah, well, not necessarily, because sometimes it's good to trust your gut. But you know, if you have someone on your team that you give more face value, for instance, and then you end up trusting him when his information isn't that good necessarily, and then you trust him over someone else with better information, and that makes your instant response not as good as it could be. So I'm trying to figure out how to not discriminate based on, you know,
who your friends are in an organization.
Factors that shouldn't really matter. And that's no easy task.
Right. So incident response.
Yes.
I'm sure everybody in this video knows what incident, or has an idea of what incident response is.
Yep.
We work a lot with that. Explain what's your definition of it.
Well, incident response could be viewed as an organized approach to addressing and managing the aftermath of security breach or cyber attack. Or you know, that's not necessarily a good definition of incident response, because there are so many attacks that shouldn't be a problem for people. You know, like having a scan or whatever going on your network. You have to be able to identify them, because it could be the first step of an attack. So you need to know that the scan is ongoing, and then you need to you know, have this logged somewhere, so that when they escalate their attack later, then you're able to connect
the dots.
what scan was the one coming coming before the attack in this case. You know, but that shouldn't necessarily warrant a full-blown IRT response, and should be maybe called more like this operational incident that the SOC or whoever is working on, you know, first line is able to deal with, cope with. You should have some playbooks or whatever that defines these kind of things. And maybe a little surprisingly, ransomware should be one of those as well. DDoS should be one of those as well.
Of like the ones that you wouldn't define as incident response?
No, it shouldn't really, you know, trigger the full-blown incident response where you know, you have this incident manager, handler, information manager, analyst, communications team. You know, you shouldn't have all these things in place when you're hit by ransomware, because ransomware you just shouldn't pay. You should just restore from backup, and if you don't have backup, then you have a huge problem. You know, so when you're first hit with the ransomware, then it's not much we could do. It's not like we're going to break the encryption. It's not like we're going to fix something that's going to be very costly, and it's a lot cheaper just to have you know, a good backup, good working backup.
So if somebody calls us right now and says, hey, we got hit by ransomware, we don't have backup, what do we say?
Tough luck.
Really?
Yeah, more or less, because it's nothing we really can do. You should just get the ransomware out and, you know, plug the hole, start all over again.
If I can ask you then, what are people calling us about? You guys are so secretive in this threat intelligence team of ours. You never tell me anything. It's probably a good thing.
Well, our clients are calling us about mostly anything that they don't have the competency of, or skills, or, you know, resources to fix themselves, or they have some resources, sometimes some skills, and they want to fix, be a part of it, and let us come and do, you know, assist them in the instant response.
Some helping hands. Yeah,
helping hands, and depending on our availability and, you know, the seriousness, and then of course we could come and help them, because this is what we do. We're professional instant responders, so we fix these kind of things. But mostly when you know, really need to work is when we're dealing with advanced persistent threats like nation states or very advanced crime syndicates. So.
And is that because you don't want to kick them out, basically, and they want, you know, why would they?
Well, eventually the goal is to kick them out, but it's not necessarily that we are able to kick them out or that we should kick them out just immediately, because we don't know who we're dealing with. We don't know what they want to get out of our clients, and then we don't know, you know, say if we have found them in one segment of the network doing some kind of recon or whatever, and then we just indicate that we know that they're there, but we haven't necessarily seen them in this part of the network, then they could just go under the radar, hide, and just let that part be kicked out, and then they could, you know, keep on operating in the part of the network where we haven't identified them yet. What
sort of actions would we do that would let them know we're there?
First of all, we could you know, start plugging the holes that they are exploiting. Yeah, you know, out of the blue, just shutting down their what we have observed their way in. So, you know, we could also do like stupid things like patching the vulnerability in front of them, or, you know, start cleaning up after them. You know, leave traces, because it's not like you see in the movies where they sit in a basement in a hooded sweater without lights on, typing like very fast on the network, or the keyboard, you know, just exploiting and shouting "I'm in" and, you know, password breach. It's not that. Yeah,
I'm in.
That's not exactly how it works, because these are regular human beings. They are at work, they work 9 to 5. They have holidays off. They have different teams. You know, they have designated tasks they have to do. So when this breach team has come in, then they're leaving all the information to the other team that's going to, you know, exploit whatever.
Speaking of phases,
yes.
When what are the phases of incident response? Like, how does it start besides us getting a phone call?
Well, it starts before this.
Okay.
Yeah, because it starts with the planning and preparation.
Yeah. I see.
And that's the governance risk compliance part of it, where you have to prepare, you have to, you know, make some what ifs, flow charts, what should we do when this happens, who to escalate to, what's the escalating trigger point, who has the mandate to do something about this.
And what percentage of organizations actually have that in place? Because I've been hearing this for forever, but apparently it's still a thing to mention.
In their minds, everyone. But when things get serious, that's when they see that whatever they had in place is not sufficient, or it produces bottlenecks or whatever.
And that's the point of like tabletop exercises, right?
Yes, that's correct. And
intense,
other
by the
exercises as well, because then you see it's a lot better to figure out where things go wrong when you have this safe environment where I'm the bad guy and not the actual bad guy is the bad guy, because I'm not going to leak your data or punish you.
No harm, no foul.
Yeah.
So planning, yeah,
and then the next one is detecting and reporting. It's important to have visibility in your network. If you have if you have a lock on your door, but you don't know, you can't see what's happening inside the house, or you can't see when the door has been opened, who opened the door, whatever. All you know if you leave the house and come back is the status when you left and the status when you come. And then if things are as they were when you left, then you just assume that no one was there. But you wouldn't know. If something is missing, then you know that someone has been there, but you don't know who, you don't know when, you don't know what else they did, you know. So detection and reporting is important to have visibility. So the next phase in incident response is assessment and decision.
So by the way, where are like the incident responders in this stage? Like, which part of the, when do we get a call as an incident response team?
Not yet, but
not yet, really. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, but after this phase, which is the assessment and decision phase.
So I'll shut up now. Go ahead.
Which is the phase where you have to assess what has happened. The doors are maybe opened in my house. I got an alert. Nothing's missing. I'm assessing the situation. Is something gone? Is something broken? What has happened? And if I assess it to be not that serious, then I wouldn't necessarily call the police to come to my house, but I would file for it's something
insurance claim.
Yeah, something illegal happened. So I need to file it somewhere, and then the response. And the response should be proportional to my assessment. So say if I figured out that someone came into my house, took all my jewelry, took all my computers, took all my money, then I would need the police to come and investigate. Maybe they broke something as well, and then we have this huge case. So we should figure out who was it and how could we return to normalization. So the last phase after the response is the lessons learned, and lessons learned means what did I do wrong to invite these people in, what could I have done differently, how could I prevent this from happening again, and if it happens again, someone breaches the door, maybe I could hide the computer, lock the jewelry somewhere else, make sure they don't get it so they can't steal it from me. So the consequences of the breach would be a lot less severe. So those are the 5 phases of incident response, and as I identified previously, the planning and preparation is for the governance risk and compliance department. Detection and reporting is for the SOC, and also the assessment and decision is also SOC material. And then the incident response team or the IRT comes in response, handling it, and then they deliver a lessons learned, which kind of is a handover back to governance, risk and compliance. And on the side of all this, we have the technical solution where you do penetration testing of yourself to identify where could be some possible vectors to attack you, etc. You have operations to install appliances, fix things, be prepared for when the shit hits the fan. So what happens when the shit hits the fan?
Yeah, what does happen when shit hits the fan?
Yeah, people call us, and then I would like to say we push a big red button and it starts blinking, and we have these tubes we jump into, and just on the way down to our Batmobile we get suited for the incident, but that's not how it happens, unfortunately. We have to do some kind of boring tasks before we can start, the mercantile part of it.
The commercial stuff?
Yes. Do we have an agreement with the customer? Do we have resources to fix this? Yeah, should we do this 24/7? Is Christmas coming up? Do we need to force people to be available for us to handle the incident? These are people, so they have people considerations to make, and we have to make them as well. And if we don't have the resources, then we can't really help the ones calling. It could be that we have already deployed all our resources on other assignments, or we just don't have what resources they need, because if they have this very specialized problem going on, we wouldn't necessarily need to have the specialized expertise, and if we have a lot of available personnel but no one with that expertise, then
there's no point. Yeah,
no,
not gonna waste
we don't have
time.
the expertise. So that's the boring
First
part.
step,
And that's something you should consider at least a little bit before you decide to outsource this competence to someone else, because if you don't have this agreement in place before your incident hits you, then it's not guaranteed that you get the response you need when you need it. And that's also a risk that you need to consider in the preparation phase. It's completely fair to say we don't want this in-house, because it takes a lot of practice, resources to maintain, the competencies, and we are, I think, 200 or so people that can handle incidents, and not all 200 have the same background or same area of interest that they want to focus on. So say we have a couple of reversers, a couple of log enthusiasts, and they do different stuff. They could all be a part of the same incident but doing
different things.
Different things. And having a reverser in-house is like, that's
good luck.
But it's doable, but it's
if you're D&B or a big
because it costs a lot, and that person, or if you have more than one, you have this community where they could evolve. But if you have that many incidents involved with reversing tasks, then you have a huge problem in the first place. So your goal should be not to have the need for all these resources. So that's our niche, because we go from customer to customer or client to client and fix this, so we get the experience. We know how the APTs evolve. We can see, they're doing some things this year, and then they're doing these things the other year, and then we have enough of assignments to just have the people constantly updated and educated on.
Is that why threat intelligence team in Mnemonic owns the incident response?
Yes.
Yeah. Awesome.
That's part of the reason, because we have to know what's happening and respond accordingly. And we are fortunate enough to be big enough and have enough assignments so that people could stay on top of their game, and that benefits us, and that also benefits the clients that need our resources, because we're updated more or less.
That's a stupid question. How long does this process usually take? From, customer calls us, wakes us up, says that we need help, and then we say, okay, cool, tell us what's happening. They explain it. We call them back a couple minutes later. Okay, we have some guys for you. They get on their PCs and start working. How long are they going to be there for?
That depends.
Yeah.
That really depends on the...
Do we have like an average that we've calculated?
Well, as most of our clients, they just want to have our stamp of approval or whatever, so they can
doing?
But they can handle some of it themselves, and then they want our expertise or maybe some insights on how to improve their processes or whatever, so we could just move in, do the assessment and deliver the report. That doesn't take long, a week, maybe 2 weeks.
Okay.
That not necessarily that long. But then on the other hand, we have these more serious cases where we have an advanced persistent threat on the other side. So we would need to have more people. It would take more time. It's not necessarily so that we should evict them, as I explained earlier, at once, because then we could be like Bush declaring the war over before it's really over, and that's it doesn't look that professional.
Yeah.
So we don't do that. But that's the other end of the scale, so that could take years. So we have very short,
and that does happen. We do have
yes,
there exist organizations out there that are being attacked like that, right?
Yes, and that's an ongoing process, and that's more like a cat and mouse, where we have it's a nation state on the other side. They want to get some kind of information, and then we should just prevent them from getting that information, or that it shouldn't come out, because that's a consequence.
But if you're there for many years, what are you doing? Like operating honeypots and just confusing them, throwing them off?
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Anything else you could say about stuff like that? Because I'm I don't even know what that entails. I was just okay, if you have 10 of our best guys with you for 4 years, why are they still there?
Yeah, it's that's a good question, and we have to give the attacker something, but not something that's valuable, and not something that compromises the clients of the client or whatever. So they should have some not important information. So, but that you have to balance a little bit. Is this compromising? Could this have legal consequences for the client? And are we indicating that we know that they're there for the attacker? So we have to give them some, but not all. Yeah. And it's a game of cat and mouse.
Sounds so much fun. When you're not the person that's being attacked, I guess.
Yeah. So say if we could just do maybe an example where we have say we have critical infrastructure, like the water and sewage in say Reykjavik, for example. And they are attacked by an advanced persistent threat. Yes. But critical infrastructure like water and sewage is like everyone needs it, and everyone's using it, and everyone has a high expectation for their services and their delivery. But it does happen that the services goes down, and that's okay. We don't have water for an hour or two. How long could you go without fresh water before you're thirsty, perhaps? Well, that maybe it depends on how fast the rabid hordes empty out your local netto. So I guess it's not that big of a problem. The water's not working, sewage is not working.
For a short period of time.
For a short period of time. But then you start expecting them to fix it. And you don't want a service that you're so relying on and depending on to be the vector for compromising of your own personal integrity or whatever data information you're serving to the provider.
And I guess it's communication. Like, I want to know what's going on at least.
Yeah.
Like, if the water's out for an hour and you tell me an hour, okay, fine. Like, I can wait an hour without water, whatever.
Yeah.
I have beer. But
Yes.
If you don't tell me anything about it, then how long am I going to go in my life before I start thinking of, what to do next and start thinking of some, not good things.
Looting and pillaging.
Looting,
So that's
Although I'll never do that.
so that's another phase or facet of incident response, because you have to do communications. You have to do external and internal communications. You have to tell the employees of Veitur that what do they have to do, and then you have to tell the people using the services what are we doing with this, what has happened, and then give them some information to just keep them calm, and that's different from non-critical infrastructure, because if the taxi service or whatever luxury services are down, then you just find a substitute or whatever, but you can't necessarily have a substitute on water, electricity, government. You don't have a spare government for when this government is not functioning. You don't have
but there's a lot of countries in the world that kind of wish they had that.
But you don't have redundant internet lines,
right?
Not or everyone doesn't have redundant internet lines. So when your provider is down, then you feel it.
By the way, the communication part, that is its own it's an art of its own, right? I feel like honesty is the best policy, and it's weird because if I see a company's like, we're getting hacked, we're under cyber attack, I look at them like, cool, thank you for telling us. Like I automatically have I sympathize towards them. That's probably because I work with cybersecurity. Other people may not like that, like, oh, that's a bad company, or but what does Mnemonic say companies should do? Is honesty the best policy, or is there a strategy?
It depends. It's we're not the communications experts, so I just have to wrap my mind around this myself. But honesty goes a long way. So if you're owning up to whatever's happening, and then you're sharing enough information for people to know what's going on, then that's good. But if you're sharing too much information, then you're obviously alerting whoever is attacking that you're onto them. So even the communication part is one way, because you're not getting communication back. So if you're just telling everyone what's going on, then obviously the perpetrator is also getting the information that you're
straight
sharing
from you,
so that's not good necessarily. And the other part of this problem is, say it's the 12th time this year that you have been hacked. Should you just go out there and say, well, we're hacked again, too bad,
good morning everybody, it's Monday and we're
so if you're constantly communicating that you're being hacked, and then you come across as somewhat incompetent, maybe, if you're not learning from your previous mistakes. So I think sharing the right information, the right amount of information in at the right time, it's crucial, and you have to do some specific assessments.
Is there any circumstances where covering it up would be actually maybe the best thing to do?
Well, with all the new GDPR legislation and things like that, you're obligated to give information to authorities and the public and whatever within due time or whatever they call it. But they also have this exception where you don't have to disclose the information if it's an ongoing investigation.
Why doesn't everybody just hide behind that then?
Well, because you can't have an ongoing investigation for a year, 2, 3, 4. So if it's a serious thing, then obviously you should hide behind the ongoing investigation part for as long as you need it. But it's also good to share some information and tell what's happening. You know, if you're swift with the response and just fix things and get them out, and that's your goal, then you could respond and then disclose, you know, because we have already fixed it, and then people are, oh, okay, but it's fixed, so let's move on. But if you're too early out there in the game and say, well, we have been hacked, and the advanced persistent threat now has access to all the pipelines in Reykjavik, and they could poison, you know, your water supply.
But have a good day.
Yeah, we're fixing it, but we don't know who is doing this or what they really want. You know, that's not kind of good information. So you have to be a little careful with what you share and how, and consider the consequences of your information, obviously.
I see why it's a fun job what you're working with here.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So do you have any like last words of advice? Do you have any you know, with all this, you're studying this, you're working with it in real life. Somebody has another podcast, but he said, you know, the whole point of security is like, actually, you know, the whole point of a SOC actually was just when something happens, just to clean it up, you know, incident response. Yep. So your whole security scheme should be giving you everything you need to respond to an incident.
Yep.
And that was an interesting way of saying it. Do you agree?
Yes, I agree. Because I usually, when I explain the steps, you know, the preparation, the you know, detection, assessment, response, etc., I used to draw circles, you know, indicating each step in the circle, and then I used to, you know, put this regular sized preparation part, and then I come to the response, and then it's a huge blob, because if you have a small preparation phase, then you have to do most of the job in the prep or the response phase. But if you're good at preparation, you know what's can hit you or how you should respond when it hits, then you have to have a lot less in the response. So the goal is to have a perfect balance between these two phases, where you have put enough money into the preparation phase, and then you wouldn't have to, you know, open your wallet when
response comes.
When the response comes in. And that's, you know, there are some things you could do to just start, and that's consider the different threat actors. You know, you have the basic script kiddies on one side, you have the hacktivists in the middle, and then you evolve to crime syndicates, and you move up to the nation states at the end, and they're like a stair, or they could be seen as some kind of stair where the first step is the script kiddie. It doesn't have a lot of skills, it doesn't have a lot of motivation, their goals are whatever comes along, and then the persistency is like, once they're in, they're moving on. So if you get them out, they're out. But that being said, you shouldn't let them in, you know, because these are not persistent at all. They are if the things they have seen online doesn't work,
they go on.
Then they wouldn't know how to, you know, escalate or evolve their attack, so they move just onto another target. So that's why the preparation should at least, you know, indicate at what level do we want to keep the bad guys out before we need to focus or put any money into responding to this. So I would say a good advice is to have enough in the beginning, just to get all these nuisances away, so you don't have to deal with them. You don't want to be owned by a 14-year-old that just found some cool tools and then exposed all of your data, you know, because you don't know who can pick up that data. And say if you have the pipelines, a script kiddie doesn't know what he's dealing with. He just puts it online and see, look what I found, and then some bad guys could just pick it up from there. They don't even have to attack you to obtain that kind of information. So that's not fortunate. So you should just move up on the stairs until you're, you know, confident with not having to handle these, and you're prepared to handle, you know, the more advanced
But just
ones.
to be a little more concrete here, what is these smaller steps, like ransomware? for example? That's like one of those things that you shouldn't have to deal with, right?
Oh well, yes, that's an attack. That's on the lower part. But I was thinking threat actors. Because the threat actors just find things, or they want to do some harm against you, and then they have different skill set, the motivation, etc. So they are just evolving. So crimeware or crime syndicates, they want to do. They have this kind of goal. They want to make money on you or whatever. Selling information that you have to other parts. And then the nation states, they have this one goal that they really want. So if you're a target of a nation state, then well, yes, you are going to be owned some way or another, because they will get in, but they make 0 days and they exploit 0 days and they get in and get information, and then you need the visibility to see them and know what's going on, and maybe learn from that attack to later, so we don't have to build enough preparation to withstand the nation state, because you can't do it, more or less, but you could pick off a lot of the less advanced attackers. But yeah, DDoS is mitigated fairly easy. Ransomware, well, it's not necessarily prevented, but it's the consequences could be prevented, that you just back up and restore, and revert to a time before the ransomware existed in your network. So yeah, you have to do that kind of preparation, and also you should practice a lot, tabletop exercises, role playing, red teaming if you're that advanced. Play around, have fun. It's when people come together and pretend they're the bad guys. You can see the imagination of your employees, at least. Usually when I was going around doing revisions, audits, my final question to my auditees were, if you were the bad guy and you had to do an attack right now, what would you do? And the competence and inside knowledge that most of these employees had led them to make up this extreme path of exploits that could just ruin an entire company in minutes, because they knew where all the holes were and where the vulnerabilities were. And having that competency within your own organization and letting them partake in a exercise could give you valuable information. And then you should just work with whatever information you get from that practice and prepare and do it iteratively.
Yeah, I've done that tabletop exercise. I was 22. And I was at my one of my first. It was at ISF, and one of the first security conferences, and that I was at. And the guy just looked at me. His name is Hans Petter. He was like, that was his job, or his main thing was to do these tabletop exercises. He's really good at it. And he looked at me, and he was like, "You're the CEO." I almost cried that day, because the whole room, people watching you, and it was making bad decisions. It's really intense. So it's but it was fun. I look back at it and I learned a lot. Yeah. So
it's a safe environment of messing up. Doing the wrong things, as long as you don't have a culture of exposing those kind of people and punishing them, but rather learn from what they have not done the right way. Then you could improve the process or whatever to make them do it right the next time. Because if there's someone that makes a mistake rarely does, it's making the same mistake again. So if they already did it in a safe environment, then they're probably not going to do it when it gets serious.
Awesome. Well, Morten, thank you for sharing your knowledge. We had like some sort of a script, but I don't know where it went. It just went all over the place. So maybe we should open up for questions.
Yes. If you have any questions, feel free.
Come with him. He'll answer them, not me. I'm just here for equipment.
Yeah.
Awesome. Good.
Hello.
Hello, guys. Thank you for a very interesting interview there.
Thank you.
Thank him.
So I guess, do you want to follow up on this, or you just want to take questions right now, or?
Questions be good.
Will be good. Okay. At least I have one for you, or actually it's two questions.
Yep.
How should we prepare to avoid having shit hit the fan? Sorry about that.
On the general level?
Yeah, well, it's, to follow it up, do you have recommendations for typical small companies on what to prioritize in defenses? Let's say someone has a basic firewall, antivirus, and little else.
Then I would start focusing on the users, the people working there, because they're the biggest or the weakest link, so to say, in information security, because you can have a lot of technical appliances in place and everything is working, but if no one is say watching the feeds, then they could just trigger all the alarms and it won't be followed up. So I would say focus on the users to prevent them from initially starting the attack or allowing the bad guys into your network. So yeah.
So educating and preparing the users.
Yeah, it's not embarrassing to ask if you're not sure how to do things, and if things look a little fishy, then talk to someone about it. And if enough people do that, then the bad things will surface sooner or later, or preferably sooner, so that you can fix it sooner.
Yeah. I noticed you talked a bit about communication, how you react and communicate with, well, media or anyone when you have an attack ongoing. I mean, it's very difficult to say. I noticed you said not too much information, not too little information, and a question of when in time.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? I mean, it's very difficult. How can we prepare for a situation like this?
I think most people they understand that things could go wrong. So if you just own the situation and start, communicating with honesty, then that gives you a little slack, a little leeway. But when it comes to when is due time, I think there are some legal obligations to when do you have to disclose that you have been breached or you've had an attack. But there's also some protection in this, because you could not disclose information if you have an ongoing and active investigation. So that means that giving information, and this is the hardest part of incident response, because it doesn't necessarily have to do with the incident, but by nature, when you're communicating externally, then you're also showing all your hands, or you could show your hands to the perpetrators, and you shouldn't obviously do that. Yeah, so there's no good answer for you should say it after 2 days, or you should disclose half of it, or there is no such blueprint for what's correct. So, yeah, it's hard.
It's hard, yeah.
You call Martin when it happens.
All right, we're almost done with the time slot. So again, thank you guys. Very interesting and funny as well.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. So our final speaker for today is Francisco Fonseca. Francisco is the VP of National Cybersecurity at BitSight. In his presentation, he'll share with the audience how Iceland is performing in the cybersecurity and how BitSight is helping organizations like ministries, national cybersecurity centers, national CERT-IS, and telecom regulators in the following areas. Increasing the cyber resilience of the country and their constituents, managing the national digital footprint, measuring the cybersecurity performance, and communicate cybersecurity performance. Francisco, very good to see you again.
Hi, Paula. Good to see you too.
The floor is yours. Welcome.
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. Can you please just confirm that you can see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So today I'll start my communication explaining what the security ratings are, how governmental agencies are using it, the constituency that they are monitoring, and at the end, I will share with the audience a picture of how we see Iceland. So Iceland from a data perspective. So let's start. First of all, to explain the ratings. So the ratings are a number that goes from 250 to 900. They are used in any type of organization, both public or private, and that number is based on data that exists in the world. That data can be open, that data in some cases is paid, in some cases exclusive, some cases proprietary. It's non-intrusive, so nothing will be installed in the organizations. There's no software, no hardware, and it's calculated on a daily basis. It's continuous. So somehow we also want to complement the approach of the pen testings, the auditings and questionnaires. Those are important, but in general, you cannot have those on a continuous basis. And it's based on objective data. So they are not based on perceptions or I've heard or questionnaires or opinions. They are based on data. And when we transform, the language of cybersecurity into a number, sometimes in certain circumstances that can be useful, as I hope you'll see at the end of the presentation. How are the ratings calculated? Well, we start with receiving data from data sources, multiple data sources. So we currently use 100 data sources, and this information can come from all over the world. After that, there is a work of mapping the assets of the organizations. And by assets, we mean the external IP addresses and the domains. So currently we have 200,000 organizations mapped around the world. And this part is very important because it's what allows us to be a ratings organization, to compare banks with banks, transportation with transportation, health sector with the health sector. This work, by the way, is done by 60 people, so both human beings and algorithms. There's a significant part that is also done by algorithms. Then there's a part where for each organization we will allocate 23 different risk vectors. There will be a slide where I'll show in more detail. And finally, the rating is calculated. This process is used both for companies, organizations, industries, and countries. So every day there is a rating for a country, for an industry in a country, and for each organization. Now, where is this being used? So this is being used in 6 main areas. Mergers and acquisitions. So when companies are investing or acquire other companies during the due diligence process, this will be part of the process. So looking at the different areas, and one area will be the cybersecurity posture of the organization that we are investing or acquiring. Executive reporting, more and more the cybersecurity topic, it's being treated at an executive level and at the board level. And it's challenging to communicate at this level, cybersecurity, right? It's not easy. So this is one use case, and we see this more and more happening across the organizations around the world. Another use case is to managing, looking at third parties. So the security of a company nowadays, it's not only the security of the company itself, but the security of all the ecosystem the company belongs to. The organizations they exchange data with, the organizations that connect to the infrastructure, and the organizations we do business with. So currently it's common for large organizations to monitor hundreds, if not thousands, of third parties. Another use case is the benchmarking. So for companies, it's getting more and more relevant for them to understand how they are performing comparing with similar organizations, with their competitors and with the industry. This is the perspective typically of the CISO. So in this case, the CISO not only wants to know how it's performing, the organization, but also wants to have information to remediate. So it wants to continuously monitor and have the capability to remediate. Cyber insurance is another area. So insurance companies need to understand the risk of the companies they are selling insurance to. This is getting bigger and bigger as we hear on a daily basis. There are cyber impacts in organizations that can be of a significant amount from a financial perspective. The last time I asked this question to a cyber insurance company, that one was protecting approximately $100 million. So when what is at stake is those amounts, I think it's important for you to have a way to continuously monitoring the risk. And finally, the topic that brought us here today, or me in this case, the national cybersecurity. When we talk about national cybersecurity, we are talking about typically the following types of governmental agencies. And by the way, we've just announced in September that we are currently working with approximately 40 countries. Iceland is one of the countries we work with, but typically the type of governmental agencies that use these solutions are national cybersecurity centers, national CERTs, in many cases telecom regulators, ministries. So some countries cybersecurity may sit under Ministry of Defense or Ministry of Digital, etc. Some departments inside ministries. And we also see in some cases law enforcement and sectoral entities like central banks. Who are they monitoring, or what's the constituents? Or when a governmental agency like one of those I just mentioned uses our solution, what they are trying to protect? Well, the use case number one is critical national infrastructure. And what we see here is that there's, we see different types of, critical infrastructures around the world. So each country will define the sectors that they consider critical infrastructure. Some countries will work with, they may have 10 companies as critical infrastructure. Some others, just on a specific sector, may have 2,000. So there's a big disparity. But those are the usual suspects, the sectors that if they suffer an impact, there will be a serious impact on the population, right? We're talking about finance, telecom, health, transportation, electricity. In some cases, those governmental agencies want to monitor the full IP address space of the country. So they may want to, have the capability to respond. Considering this severe vulnerability, what are the IP addresses in my country that are vulnerable to this vulnerability? And when they have this perspective, in general, they work with closely with the telecom operators, because when you try to identify this type of information at a national level, the way you can then operationalize is sharing this data with typically the telecom, because in this case, we'll be including both companies and residential users. By the way, we see sometimes some interesting use cases. For instance, with Bluekeep, there was a country working with the telecom operators. In one of the telecom operators, he was able to reduce blue-chip vulnerability in the country by 70%, which is significant, right, in a short period of time. The other constituents we see very frequently is government. And by the way, when governmental agencies can generate reports for the companies, government is the most popular sector. So it's interesting to see that on those 40 countries, the reports that are being more generated on the platform are related with governmental entities. Here, they want to monitor all the ministries in the countries and some governmental agencies. Interestingly, we start also to see countries monitoring companies that are relevant from an economical perspective. So some companies will not be considered critical infrastructure. I'm going to give one example. Imagine a clothing or apparel company being considered critical. So in some countries that is happening. The reason is, first, those companies, if they are very big, imagine a company, I'm remembering one that has revenues is 25 billion euros. So that company, if the company suffers an impact, and that impact has a significant financial impact on the company at the end of the year, so imagine a financial impact of 500 million euros. Imagine the loss in terms of taxes for the government. So that's one perspective. The other one is the impact on the population, so on the families. Sometimes some companies may have hundreds of thousands of employees. Some of those companies may be concentrated in regions where a significant part of the population is working for that company. So from that perspective, an impact, a cyber impact, a significant cyber impact in that organization can have a serious impact on dozens of thousands of families. So it's interesting to see. When I started this, I didn't imagine those situations happening, but we are seeing those happening, which is interesting. In some cases, some countries will also want to look at the other companies, including SMB. So they would like to have, if possible, to know a little bit more about what's happening on the SMBs. I'll come back to the SMBs later on in the presentation. Another constituents that we are seeing is the regional and sectoral infrastructure. This one is interesting. So we see in some countries, governmental agencies that will be responsible for a specific region of the country. Could be a state, or could be a different type of region. In some cases, some entities will be looking just at a specific sector. So in some cases, some countries will only be monitoring telecom or government or financial and energy. Health sector is getting more and more popular for obvious reason, considering the current context. And another very recent use case that is very interesting and only appeared this year is that we start seeing cities coming to us with a perspective of protecting, the assets of the city. And by that, we mean the network infrastructure. And when they do that, they are also, monitoring what's happening with the citizens of the cities, but also the critical infrastructure of the city. So some cities will share with us the airport, the hospitals, police department, water company, because they start to be concerned with that, or they want to monitor, or they want to be capable of measuring those organizations. Although many times they are not yet empowered to do anything, but they feel that they should be having some visibility on what's happening out there. This is pretty recent, but we are already starting working with cities. By the way, the two previous use cases, regional and smart cities, to be capable of providing a solution for those, we need to make some changes in the product, because our data, as you can imagine, was the compartments were per country. We needed to create in some countries specific regions inside those countries. So a lot of challenges from an engineering perspective. The last use case is observatory and analytics. So some countries are using this data in order to obtain metrics, KPIs, trends that are going on in the country. That will help them on, prioritizing some investments, prioritizing areas that require more investment, deciding some policies and programs, and then having the capability to measure those, to follow up on the results. So that's kind of the constituency we are seeing in those governmental agencies. And when we work with those agencies, we typically work at 3 different levels. And sometimes, depending on the countries, we may have, the same team doing almost all the different layers. In some other countries, we may have hundreds of people, in some of these layers. The 3 layers we see are strategic, tactical, and operational. At a strategic level, we are typically talking about people that, in general, they're responsible for the national CERT or the National Cybersecurity Center. Many times they will report to someone at a ministry or even to a minister or even prime minister and president. So we have all those scenarios. I will, in the subsequent slides, I'll drill down in a little bit more detail in each of those use cases. At the tactical level, we are helping program managers, accounts managers, and sectoral managers. Program managers are persons that inside those organizations, they need to run a specific program. One example can be one program to create a dashboard to provide visibility on national cybersecurity, so with some KPIs and indicators. Another program can be building a platform for sharing threat intel between the critical infrastructure, etc. And then we have account managers and sectoral managers. I'll start with the sectoral managers. Sectoral managers in many governmental agencies have the responsibility to interact with a specific sector. So it's common in some countries to have someone that will be the point of contact or the interface with the electric sector, or with the finance, or with the telecom sector. Those are the sectoral managers. Account managers, we see those in very mature countries and highly sophisticated. So in some cases, we've seen governmental agencies putting one person sitting on premise on the critical infrastructure. I think this is interesting because if one day there is an attack or a crisis, I guess that coordination will be much easier if they have that capability. And then a third layer or third level is operational one. Here is where typically, the highly specialized security people are. Here we are talking about dealing with events, integrations, automatizations, incident response, etc., etc. So let's move to the subsequent slides where I'll share with you which challenges we are trying to solve or trying to help in those governmental agencies. So the persons, the person in front or in charge of those organizations, nowadays, one of the main challenges they have is to communicate cybersecurity. They need to communicate, to the person that provides the budget. Sometimes it's a politician. And we can imagine that if it's difficult to talk cybersecurity, even with someone that knows about security, imagine talking cybersecurity with someone that is not so familiar. Talking to non-technical people is another challenge. Talking to the media, so we see more and more countries saying, "Hey, we get a lot of questions from the media, and we would like to have information to provide to them, right?" More and more, also, this type of governmental agencies in general, their budgets are going up. As we have more awareness around this topic. Typically, in general, around the world, governmental agencies are getting more money, so they need to justify, where the money is being used. And this is a hot topic nowadays for the media. Talking to non-technical people will also include talking with executives of the constituents. One of the responsibilities, I would say, also at this level, is for this person to generate awareness. And sometimes, having breakfast or having lunch or at an event, having a conversation with an executive from the constituent would be interesting if I can share information with that person that the person will understand, or at least that will generate awareness in that person, so that when the person goes back to the company, they can have a conversation, they can discuss this topic. Finally, one of the things that at this level they also want to know is how my country is performing in general. How do we compare with our neighboring countries? Sometimes they select other benchmarking countries, may not be the neighbors, and how the different industries are performing. So the question can be how the financial institutions in my country are performing comparing with the financial institutions of Germany, for instance. So at this level, they may want to know this type of information. Now, at sectoral level, what are the challenges? How we are helping them? So when the governmental agency interacts with the constituencies, what are some of the areas where currently we are working with the countries? One is having objective conversations with the constituents. So if I have constituents, if I interact with them, it will be normal to have meetings, to have conversations. And the same way that when I go to a doctor, it will probably be beneficial. Imagine a doctor, I'm entering the room and the doctor already has my blood analysis. Most likely the conversation we are going to have will be more direct, directly targeted to the point, will be more relevant. The doctor will be probably doing more pertinent questions and all that. So the idea here is more or less the same. So, we will provide this type of information around each constituent. Remember when I mentioned the 23 risk vectors? So here in this picture, you can see some of those risk vectors. And for each risk vector, we provide a grade from A to F. So the governmental, the person from the governmental agency, when talking with the constituent, they could ask some questions or discuss some topics where eventually, at least from what is perceived from the outside, the risk could be higher. Right. In this case, considering that at SPF the grade is F, they could start talk around, what is your policy around phishing, around SPF, DKIM, etc., etc. And then measuring progress. By the way, the moment the constituents remediate those things and we see progress, that's another interesting aspect and positive outcome, because we know that in security, many times we receive budget and we do investments so that nothing happens. I think it's great when not only nothing happens, but also we can show progress. But we know how challenging it is to show progress in our area. We are like the referees on a soccer game. They only talk about us when things go south, right? I believe that with this type of information I'm sharing with you today, you can see that it's also possible to talk about cybersecurity even when nothing happens and to show progress. Measuring the performance and understand gaps. Another thing that can be done is imagine the capability for the governmental agency to compare one constituent against the other 100 companies in the world from those 200,000 that are more similar to the constituent. Same sector, same amount of employees, same amount in terms of infrastructure. Wouldn't it be great? And then, we can, the constituent could see where they stand on those, 100 organizations that are more similar to the constituent. Incentivizing improvement. So in some countries, they are sharing the rankings across, the members of the sector. Interesting, the data is anonymized here, so there's some blur. On the platform, the data is visible, but interesting, there are some countries that will blur the names so that when they are sharing this with the constituents, they only show the name of the company that they are giving the report. So that way, the ones on the bottom will not feel uncomfortable because they know that, although they are at the end, this visibility is not being provided to others. In some other cases, they will talk about this very openly. It's interesting to see how culturally each country will deal with this in a different way. So that's very interesting to see how different countries perform. But what we see when this happens is that in general, and I think this is part of us human beings, is that we don't like to be at the top, right? And we all like to look good in the picture. So when this is done, in general, what happens is that there is a positive pressure towards the top from the organizations at the bottom. This works not only at a sectoral level, but also, across multinationals. The same approach is happening in multinationals. So there are some multinationals that they may have dozens of subsidiaries around the world. And I used to work with one of the biggest banks in the world, and what they would analyze at the board, at the meeting, where the CEOs of the most important countries, the CEOs of that bank in the different regions will meet, and then the top CEO, so the group CEO, will share the three best subsidiaries and the three worst. I don't need to ask what would happen to the three worst, right? So they didn't want to appear on the bottom again in 3 months later, right, or 6 months. So with this simple gesture, they could create, significant awareness and sense of urgency on those countries. Small but big detail, I would say. And then we have the collaboration. So the collaboration is when the governmental agency decides to provide visibility to the constituents. So the governmental agency has the capability to share this information with the constituency. By the way, the CERT in Iceland has access to this platform. So if anything that you see here during my presentation, you'd like to know more detail or details around your own organization, please feel free to reach out to the CERT and they will be able to help you. So at an operational level, how are we helping? Well, we are providing continuous monitoring to the constituents. So governmental agencies have the capability to follow the critical infrastructure, to monitor on a daily basis. And if there is a change on the rating, for some reason, they can receive alerts, and then they can investigate and try to understand the reason behind that change. They also want to respond to incidents, obviously. And here, one of the helps we provide is to provide historical data. So it will be possible for the governmental agencies to go back in time 1 year for the organizations, 1 month for the full country, to try to understand what we were seeing, in the last weeks or in February when the incident took place. So it's possible with this capability. It's possible for the governmental agency to go back in time and see and understand that in February we just had an incident in an African country on affecting financial institutions, and it involved one institution, one technological company. We realized we were able to see that some months before, that organization for some weeks had one service, the certificate was expired, for instance. We can sometimes go back and see that a router was exposed during 1 week, or an infection took place at a certain point in time. So we have the capability to go back in time. At this level, because we talk about a lot of information, we also have, of course, APIs. So at this level, we have APIs where countries can export all the data related with the country on a daily basis, and also all the data related with the constituents. So because we only keep the data for 1 year, in some cases they may want to go back. So many countries will export that information and keep that information for future usage. And of course, that having this integration with APIs allow all sorts of automations that are required when we are talking about this significant amount of information. Problem prevention. This is probably one of the use case number 1. Most of the countries will want to search for vulnerabilities, mostly the most important ones, the severe ones, right? And they want to know who are the companies that are impacted by this vulnerability or the IP addresses in my country. So this is probably use case number 1. And here, as an example, so if I click here, in this case, I'm going to select CV 2019-0708 Blue Keep. So then we can, in this case, immediately showing some of the critical infrastructure affected by it, or in a different screen, in a different dashboard, all the IP addresses in the countries. So those are some of the ways we are helping countries at the different levels. I hope that you enjoyed what you've seen. I'm going to enter now the last part of the presentation, where I'm going to share with the audience how Iceland is performing, from a BitSight perspective. So looking at all this data that we receive, we are trying to measure the cybersecurity performance of countries. And here it goes. I've never been in Iceland, but looking at the pictures, your country should be amazing. So looking forward to visit. It will be a good sign, because it would mean that probably the vaccine is already there when I go to Iceland. What is the rating of a country? The rating of a country is the rating of all the IP addresses of the country. So this will include both companies and residential users. So what you are going to see in a few moments reflects not only the security posture of the companies, but also the security posture of the citizens of that country, okay? So, and by the way, some of these ratings, when you talk at the national level, when it's sectoral level, it's only companies, but when it's national level, citizens have a high influence. So the rating of Iceland is 620. This is, from 1st of October. Let's do a comparison with the G7 countries. So if we would compare Iceland with the G7 countries, Iceland sits between UK and France. The black bar is the rating 1 year ago. So it's interesting to see that from all those countries, Iceland was the one that improved, and Germany. Germany is the best, is the country that presents a better security posture. And from this, Canada is the one that has the worst. By the way, I apologize. Now looking at the slide, I'm noticing that one country is missing, which is Italy. Italy will be at the right. So Italy will have a rating of, I think, 590. So when the company that did the presentation added Iceland, they for some reason removed Italy. So welcome to the G7, suddenly. European countries. Now, looking at European countries, this is where Iceland was 1 year ago. I don't know if this is what we would expect, but this is what the data shows, and this is where Iceland is today. So if I go back, you can see that you jumped maybe 2 or 3 positions. I think what is interesting, first of all, this graph is probably the most popular graph for when dealing with politicians. I can tell you that yesterday I had one country from EU requesting me this slide because they needed to share with the Prime Minister. This is how one would communicate GDP. This is how they would communicate unemployment. Why not using a similar language? And looking at those countries, I think it's interesting because for us Europeans, this is not surprising. If we look at the distribution, we can see Nordic countries, Central Europe, South of Europe, and then Eastern of Europe. Would be, I would say, a distribution we would eventually expect, right? So it's interesting how you get, to trillions of events, you apply an algorithm, and this is the distribution that goes out from that algorithm. So very small countries, of course, can have high fluctuations, like the Holy See. So Holy See is clearly an outlier, or Monaco. Those countries can have, a big change from one year to the other. Those are very special. But for others, the fluctuations are not so high. Although Ukraine, as you can see here, improved a lot. Ukraine, considering 1 year ago, and Ukraine is it's not a small country. Ukraine had a good improvement last year. The other reading, countries will be doing is if I am above or below the average. So it's also interesting to see if we are above, below, and also if we did a progress last year or not. Next, countries will want to know how they are performing comparing with other countries, just a smaller subset. And looking into this graph, what we can see is that, the best country is Germany and Finland. Those are the two best ones. And then on the right, you can see the ones that improved over the previous 12 months and the ones that remained the same and the ones that got worse. In this group, no one got worse, but we have 4 countries where Iceland is included, where we've observed an improvement in the previous 12 months. And on the other countries, they've remained with the same rating. Although with some fluctuations, what we are measuring is what was the rating 1 year ago? What is the rating this year? And as we can see, some countries are more stable than others. Now, let's look at the industries in Iceland. The rating of an industry, by the way, is the rating of all IP addresses in Iceland that belong to an organization from that industry. So if we are looking at the finance industry, it will include both, Icelandic banks and banks from other nationalities. This is the concept of, the finance rating in Iceland. We could have a different concept, and it's possible to obtain, which is the average rating of the Icelandic banks. That is possible. We need to group all those in a folder, and then we can have, the rating for the Icelandic banks. But in general, when we look into a country, we'll look at, all the IP addresses that belong to a specific sector. Now, when we do this exercise, this is what we were seeing in October 2019. This is the distribution, and this is today's distribution. So when we compare what we are seeing on the 1st of October this year with last year, we can see things like, there are some sectors that got worse and some that improved. The 3 ones that interestingly, had a higher impact or, which rating went down were government, healthcare, and education. Those 3 are the ones with a higher drop. And then we have some that improved: utilities, engineering, food production, for instance. Sometimes this can be interesting, for instance, for someone to prioritize on the sectors, which ones may require more attention or more resource or more investments, prioritization. I didn't bring to the presentation the comparison with you or the rest of the world, but that's also possible. So some countries will compare. This is just a comparison with the previous year. Some countries will also compare and try to understand how my different sectors are performing, comparing with the average of EU or G7 or G20 or Asian countries, etc., etc. This type of information will provide that perspective. Now, we are looking now at the full IP infrastructure. So we don't care if it's company or not. We will care now about the different risk vectors. So how, and on the subsequent slides, we'll be doing an exercise around how Iceland is performing in different risk vectors, comparing with Europe, the average of Europe. In this case, again, the higher the better. So having the rating in the top, the higher the number, the better. So what this tells us is on the different risk vectors, if Iceland is performing better or worse than Europe. We can see, for instance, the configurations of the SSL certificates until the certificates per se, if they have certificates expired or not, weak certificates. I can tell you that we have one country right now starting a program to improve the certificates of their companies. So what they are doing is, first, getting the information around all the certificates in the country with problems. And then they will start a campaign and a program, and then they will be measuring the change of that in the subsequent months. So this is an example of a program. and this can be obtained, using this. So hopefully, if the program goes well, they should see this going up, right? Open ports, how the companies in general, in terms of firewalls, how the citizens and the companies are performing. In this case, in Iceland, the performance is significantly better. The same for the certificates, by the way. In terms of web application headers, so here Iceland is slightly behind. In terms of server software, we are measuring the obsolete software that is being used by organizations. So when someone is using an Internet Information Server 6 or an Apache version that is not supported anymore, or a WordPress, if they are using obsolete software, we will be monitoring. In this case, we see that more in Iceland than in average of Europe. Could be another program. Why not? Look at all the server software that is exposed on the internet that is obsolete, and try to have the organizations updating that software to a version that is supported. In terms of insecure systems, they're pretty in line with Europe. And now looking at some other risk vectors. Botnet infections, significantly better. And next slide, I will talk in more detail around the botnet infections. We have also malware servers here. So this means the fact that it went down in this period means probably that some malware servers have been identified in Iceland. So malware server is a server that will be bringing more compromised machines to a botnet. So it's typically, the command and control servers. So they will be probably right now we are not seeing, so the rating went up. Malware server is much more unstable because we are talking about sometimes, depending on the countries, can be probably in the case of Iceland can be just a relatively small amount. In the case of Netherlands or Germany, we'll be talking about probably some dozens, sometimes hundreds of machines per month being detected and being malware servers. By the way, interesting malware servers, Europe is the worst continent. Why? Because typically the bad guys will be looking for good infrastructure and not expensive. And it looks like that they find that in the Netherlands and in Germany, mostly in the Netherlands, by the way. So Netherlands probably is a country where bandwidth, they probably provide extremely reliable infrastructure with good bandwidth for a not very expensive price. So the criminals like us, like the good SLAs, right? Potentially exploited. In this case, right now, Iceland this is something similar to botnets, but we could not consider botnets. This could be, for instance, an add-on on a browser that can be remotely controlled by someone else. So it's not really a botnet, but there's a potential risk there. So we will include on the category of potentially exploit. Spam that is coming out from machines from Iceland. So it's not the spam being sent by companies, it's spam being sent by botnets. In this case, Iceland, interestingly, it's below Europe. Unsolicited communications in line, although here there was a change in the infrastructure, and right now we are, for a certain period, we are not receiving this information. So that's why it's flat there. File sharing, I was surprised by this one, I must confess. I was not expecting. File sharing in Iceland, we see more file sharing than in the average of Europe. I don't know if this could mean that, and the reason is that typically countries that do a lot of file sharing will not have a lot of infections, and in your case, you don't have infections. So this is the what, sometimes we don't know the why, right? So this is what we see. We may eventually try to investigate the why, but I think this is what surprised me the most. Now, in terms of botnets, I think this graph, I love this graph because this graph tells us the amount of infections per each 100 internet users in the country. For a few moments, try to think about, crime in the real world. If you have two countries, one with one criminal per each 100 citizens, another country with 10 criminals per each 100 citizens, where are we going to see more crime at the end of the year, more homicides? Of course, on the country that has 10 criminals per each 100 inhabitants. Now, if we agree that that is true, and I'm talking at the national level, maybe at the company level is different, but at the national level, those numbers make all the difference. So imagine now that instead of talking about the crime in the real world, we are talking about the crime on cybercrime. And cybercrime, the impact on a country, I think it's not only the impact that appears on the news, on the headlines. There's a significant impact that is silent. It's an impact coming from those people that will lose all their photos. On the other day, I was before the lockdown, I remember to be on a restaurant, and I had 3 old women behind me, and one of the women was talking about, she was so sad because she lost all the photos on her computer. She was really sad. And we know that this happens. Probably everyone here knows someone that lost all their photos. Now, losing all the computer, imagine someone doing the PhD, forgot to do the backup, last backup was from 6 months ago, and then suddenly there's no thesis anymore on the computer. What's the impact to that person? Tremendous. Small, medium business that are losing their information, that they don't have access to their systems. They have problems because of this. Now, if we believe that many of those situations will be happening because of a malware, and in most cases it is, right, a ransomware, a malware, this type of graph then will tell us how many persons per each 100 internet users in the country BitSight is seeing communications to C2s, to the command and control servers. So basically we are talking about infections. And what we see here is that the country that has less is Finland. And more important than the number 2 or 5 or 10, it's the proportional. I think what is really relevant is to understand the proportionality. To know that one country has 3 times more infections than the other one. And we are talking about Europe. So, for multiple reasons, the countries that have been provided for this presentation are pretty good, are excellent. In general, there are some that are above some countries in Europe. This is the average of Europe, you can see here. This is Finland, then we see Iceland, then we see Norway and Denmark, then we see Sweden, and then we see Germany, and Netherlands, UK and France, Spain. I don't know if you noticed the pattern. I can tell you that in general, almost always, on the, if you list using this criteria, and this is based on 300 malware families, we see, for you to have an idea, every second, we see thousands of events, so thousands of communications to C2s. So this information, I think it's significantly representative. But it's interesting that if you order all the countries by the amount of infections per internet population, on the top 6, you have 5 Nordic countries. The country that typically is also included there is Japan. I don't know the reason. Maybe you know, but what I know is that probably the way Nordic countries perform in front of a computer is different, because you are significantly better, even compared with other, advanced countries. So we are not comparing with, countries that are not developed. All the countries here are, highly developed. We don't know the why. And by the way, we'll probably write an history around this. We'll try, if someone in this call has some explanations, I would love if you could share with me. At the end, there's an email address, because we'll be writing an article around this. I think that it's when you sit in front of I think it's related also with the money. So probably you use good antivirus, good firewalls. You don't do you don't do the illegal download, although we see in Iceland. That's why I was surprised. Because typically we don't see a lot of illegal downloads, but there's something that Nordic countries do differently because they are performing significantly better than other countries. Now, next slide, and I think this is I'm almost finishing. This is the last part. I have 3 slides, and I think they are also interesting. So in the next 3 slides, I'll be sharing with you the posture of some of the organizations that I've been provided. So I've been provided with, I think, around 30 organizations, important organizations in Iceland, and I'm going to try in 3 slides to show, the performance of those organizations in the previous 12 months. So here we can see, first of all, we are seeing the delta between where the organizations were 1 year ago and where they are today. Having an arrow up is a good sign. It means that the security posture improved. So there were things that have been done on those companies that made them to improve. The other ones went down. It's interesting to see that, there's, I'll say probably, 40% went, maybe 35% went up, 40% down, the remaining remains stable. If you look at the table on the right, the chart on the right will tell us the distribution. And by the way, this is another slide that is interesting to communicate how in a single slide, we can tell the Prime Minister how the critical infrastructure is performing. So we can tell, Mr. Prime Minister, all those millions that you are providing to us, in this graph, you can see the progress that we are obtaining. In this case, there's some progress. So I think the good news is that there's some progress. So 1 year ago, those companies, we had 16 high risk. Nowadays, we have 5. So one organization in high risk moved into probably intermediate risk. And then 1 year ago, we have 11 in low risk, and now we have 12. So one company from the intermediate risk moved to the 12. As you already understand, so I think over time, if we can make this movement towards improving, I think that will be great. A single slide that describes the effort that has been made by 30 organizations during 1 year. The next slide will show how those organizations are performing against the sector. And I apologize, another typo here. So this is not finance benchmarking. Those are not all banks. To be honest, I even don't know if there are banks there. You're gonna, when reading the names for me, it's very difficult, as you can imagine, to understand what type of company. But what we are doing here is measuring each company against the benchmarking, the average rating of the sector where the company is in. The good news is that most of the Icelandic companies are above the sector, so they are performing better than their peers. Now, when we put these 2 informations together, and this is my last slide, I apologize, I went a little bit over, but I'm promising 30 seconds. This is a picture we have for those organizations. And, we can do this exercise per sector, so we can see the picture of each sector. But what this picture tells us is the following. Companies, it's good to be on the top right quadrant, because this organization improved over the previous 12 months, and it's significantly better than the average. Here is the average. Most of the organizations, as we can see, are above the average. Some are below the average of the industry. Some are not only below, but also in the previous 12 months went significantly down. So because many times those governmental agencies don't have the capability to deal with all of the critical infrastructure at once, this could help, for instance, on the prioritization. Why not start working or collaborating with the organizations that are here in this quadrant? By the way, if you want to know, I don't know if everyone here in this call belongs to those organizations, but if you want to know where your organization is, which dot belongs to you, if you reach out to the CERT, they may be able to give you this information. So just as a teaser. And with this, I finish my presentation. So you have my email address there. If you have any ideas around why Nordic countries are performing better than all the other countries in the world, please share those ideas with me because we want to write one document around that. Thorleifur, I'm finished.
Thank you, Francisco. There was a lot to take from this, and thank you. Very, very interesting.
Welcome.
I think it's interesting for all the participants in the call. Maybe surprising to some, but yeah, very good. Thanks.
Welcome.
I see that I have one question here for you. Maybe people are getting tired, so, but at least there's one question here. According to your organization's report, BitSight security ratings range from 250 to 900. To someone outside your organization, these numbers seem arbitrary. Can you expand upon why this range has been chosen?
Yes, excellent question. This is not really arbitrary. So I think those numbers exist because this BitSight is an American company, and that rating is similar to the financial credit ratings that exist in the US. So in general, they are very familiar with that. I agree with that person that they may mean nothing, but what I can tell is that at the beginning it may seem strange, but then you completely understand, and then you get you start getting the sentiment, what means exactly what. Even to help on that, we created 3 intervals. So if you look, I believe I'm still sharing my screen. If I go into the slides, the explanation why the numbers are there is because those are similar to the financial ratings that already exist, and everyone is familiar with those. But to help that person to understand what the number means, there are 3 intervals. So between 250 to 600, this company has a basic security posture. A company between 750s and 900s has an advanced security posture. So the higher the number, the lowest is the risk. So this person, if over time people will get used, and people will remember well the rating in general. They remember well the rating they have and the rating where they want to get, at least for the organizations that want to do that exercise.
Thank you. Very good explanation. Thank you. So I don't see any more questions. So I'd like to thank you for your participation in your presentation. Hope to see you soon in Iceland. I know we had talked about you coming to Iceland, but we live in a strange world.
Exactly.
See you soon, hopefully.
Thank you very much, Thorleifur. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation. It was a pleasure. Thank you. Goodbye.
Og fyrir ykkur hinn sem voruð með okkur í dag, takk ykkur kærlega fyrir þátttökuna. Þessar kynningar verða aðgengilegar og ég veit ekki betur heldur en að við munum senda út upplýsingar það hvernig þið getið nálgast þær. Að því sögðu held ég sé ekkert annað heldur en að þakka ykkur bara fyrir. Vonaði hafi haft gagn og kannski eitthvað gaman að þessu. Takk kærlega.